Hey everybody, this is James Lindsay and you are listening to the new Discourses Podcast, and we're going to continue talking about the Nazi experiment. I'm going to kind of give you a little framing on what we're doing. This is an ongoing series. It got its inspiration actually from me reading a chapter of Mein Kampf, describing what I called woke nationalism and the Nazi experiment. And I like this framing of the Nazi experiment so much that I've decided that we're going to explore more of Mein Kampf and related Nazi subjects. And recently, there was another episode of this series that was put out where I read through the first chapter of the second volume of Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is in 2 volumes, and they each, I think, have 12 chapters. Well, my original podcast was from the second chapter of the first. That's not part of this series, technically. And the second podcast outlined Hitler's idea for the weltanschauung and the state. So the weltanschauung and the party, where he was describing the Nazi party having behind it what he called a racialist worldview. And so that racialist worldview, racialist is an antiquated word that means racist. So it was him explicitly saying that the Nazi party was organized around a racist conception of reality. And so a lot of the Nazi experiment series is going to talk about what Hitler's actual organization of the Nazi party was. So and program, I should say, really, the Nazi experiment. And so in this episode, which we'll turn to shortly, I'm going to read chapter 11 of the first volume. So I'm going to go backwards so that we can now explore what that racialist worldview actually contains. But I want to kind of break down why I'm framing it as a Nazi experiment. I also want to kind of, as an introduction, hopefully I'll remember to do this, it's not in my notes, but I also want to explain what's meant by a racialist or a racist worldview that the whole party's organized around. Of course, that's the topic of the first episode in the series, and I hope you'll go back and listen to it, or have listened to it already. But I think it's worth summarizing. And so, first things first, why am I talking about a Nazi experiment? And the reason is because I want to approach the issue. I don't think Nazis are good. I think Nazis are very bad. I think that Hitler was very bad. I do not have this kind of open-ended inquiry about Hitler, or the Nazis, given what history proved about them. And I do not accept the woke right lie that we've been lied to about everything that happened in the 20th century, particularly including World War II and the Nazis. So I thought that maybe if I read Hitler's own words, it would pull back the curtain on some of those lies where people are trying to kind of whitewash him. For example, people say that Hitler wasn't particularly animated against Jews. But to read Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925, Hitler took power, for the historically unaware, in 1933. World War II began in either 38 or 39. And World War II ended in 1945. And so a full 20 years before the end of World War II and more than a decade before the beginning of World War II, so well before the concentration camps and all of the death camps and all of the things that we all associate with the horrors of Nazi Germany with the Jews, well before that, Hitler was writing down very clearly what he thought about the influence of Jews on his society, and it's not good. And so we're going to pull that curtain back, or pull that mask off, and show that these attempts to whitewash Hitler as somebody who just really loved the German people are complete fabrications and lies. They are leaving out basically everything essential. And what way to prove that these people are lying better than to read Hitler himself saying it repeatedly in the manifesto that became the key object of his party and of his Reich. Every German owned a copy of Mein Kampf, but as we read previously, very few had actually opened them. But at any rate, the situation in Germany was bad after World War I, and Hitler was not incorrect to notice that the situation in Germany was bad after World War I. I'm not going to get into all of the various things like I did in the previous episodes, but I am going to just mention that there's a slogan floating around out there in woke right land that is Weimar problems require Weimar solutions. And this, of course, is deranged, but this is what the point of framing it as a Nazi experiment is all about. There are many ways in which the degenerate Weimar Republic has kind of come back to life in modern America. Of course, there's a very famous book about that called The Ominous Parallels that were supposed to be, many years ago, a warning about the Weimarization, in a sense, of the West or of America. But the point is that even if we have Weimar problems, which because of our Constitution we kind of don't, but even if we did, the slogan from the woke right radicals is that Weimar problems require Weimar solutions, by which they mean the Nazis, or something akin to it. The Nazis proposed a solution to the problems of the Weimar Republic, of Germany in the interwar period. And that solution didn't work out. It was a bad attempted solution. So if we frame out that what happened with the rise of the Nazi Party, with Adolf Hitler, with the Nazi Reich taking over Germany and attempting to conquer Europe and eventually initiating World War II, eventually ending in calamity, if we frame that out as an experiment for dealing with a certain class of social problems, or a certain suite of social problems, and we see that experiment resulted in catastrophe, maybe some of the wiser voices and minds out there will realize that maybe we have similar problems, but that solution set doesn't work. We did that test. We did the experiment. Empirical evidence is in. It was shit. And so the Nazi experiment is what they attempted to use to fix the problems of Germany, and it was a catastrophe. That's the point of the framing. And so what we've talked about so far in this series, this only being the second episode technically, is Hitler's concept of the racialist worldview or world concept or weltanschauung of the, which I never say German words right, so calm down, of the Nazi Reich or the Nazi Party. And so I read that chapter, and this is, I think, very important to understand. Hitler's idea, to briefly summarize, was in fact, and we're going to hear this in explicit detail today, was in fact that the point of the state is to preserve the superior race, to enable the superior race to arise and to set the tone and the tenor for the state as it goes forward so that it can be the most successful state possible. And so in this episode, we talked about how Hitler, in the previous episode, we talked about how Hitler had a racialist world concept at the center of his Nazi experiment. That's the worldview that animated and motivated the entire Nazi project, is the racialist worldview. In fact, it's an ultranationalism that's actually encoded through ethno-nationalism off of a mythical ideal of the Aryan race being located in the German Teutonics and the Nordics, primarily more than anyone else. And this all has a lot of understanding that has to be unpacked to understand what in the universe Hitler's weird race occultism, because that's really what it is, where it came from, and so on. But the point is that he believed that an intentionally racist world order is a necessary object in order to create a functional state that can survive the various challenges that states endure, and this experiment failed. So as I said, in this episode, we're going to read chapter 11 of the first volume, which is titled People and Race. This is a long chapter, so I'm not going to read all of it as it turns out, but I'm going to read most of it, about probably 2/3, not quite 2/3, and I'll explain a little bit about the part that I'm skipping, which is literally a 12-point summary of why the Jews are a problem and how they become a problem in extraordinary detail and length. And I'm going to try to make it clear, or I don't think I'll have to try very hard, what this racialist world concept is about. And I'm going to try to make it clear how this not only informed Hitler's entire policy, including his eugenics policies, but also his deliberate hatred for the Jews and his desire and priority of exterminating them. Again, this being published in 1925, long before World War II, long before, as some people have claimed very famously, allegedly America's most honest historians have claimed, as Tucker Carlson characterized these people, or this person, has claimed that Hitler was basically pressed into, unfortunately, getting rid of the Jews for expedience sake. But that is not what was going on at all, as we will be able to hear. So without further ado, let's turn to reading this particular chapter of Mein Kampf, chapter 11 of volume 1, which is People and Race. He says, there are certain truths which are so completely obvious that for the very reason that they are so common, the average person does not see them, or at least does not recognize them. And I'll remind the listeners that I am reading the uncensored Ford translation. I have a different translation of Mein Kampf that I read from also, not out loud usually, that's, I think, more raw. But I'm using the Ford translation, and this happens to be the uncensored version. So he starts off by saying there are very obvious truths that people won't recognize simply because they're so common. This is that general idea you always hear, is that the fish doesn't recognize the water he swims in. He says a man may often pass blindly by such obvious truths and be utterly astonished when someone suddenly discovers a fact that everybody should have already known. So he's framing out that what he's about to explain is perfectly obvious to everybody. Everybody already knows it, and they just won't admit it because it's so obvious. He says Columbus's eggs are lying around by the hundreds of thousands, but a Columbus is rare indeed. There's an editor's note here. The egg of Columbus refers to an idea or discovery that appears obvious after it is made. The reference is based on a common story about Christopher Columbus. So it's one of these things where you say it and everybody says, yeah, it's obvious, even though nobody was saying it before. All men, Hitler tells us, without exception, stroll about the garden of nature, arrogantly assuming they know and are familiar with all of it. So notice he's going to make a claim to nature, a kind of naturalistic fallacy, claiming that that which is natural is good, which should actually send the hair up on the back of the neck of any Christian listening. He says, yet with few exceptions, they pass blindly over one of the most striking principles of nature's rule. This is, remember, the first paragraph of the chapter. The inner separation of the various species of all of Earth's living creatures. So he's talking about the fact that different species are different from one another, and that is going to lend itself as an obvious fact to something else, which you can already guess is going to be race. And so let's continue. I'm going to scroll down, pardon me. Even the most casual observer, Hitler tells us, can see a firm basic law that rules all the countless creatures in which nature expresses her will to live. So nature has a will to live, and it expresses itself in all these various different ways, in all these different creatures, but there's a basic law that rules all of them. And he says it's that all of the different forms of animals keep within their specific boundaries, within their own species, when propagating or multiplying their kind. I don't think he had a whole lot of genetics going on here behind him, despite being a eugenicist. Every animal only mates with another of the same species. The titmouse pairs with the titmouse, the finch with the finch, the stork with the stork, the field mouse with the field mouse, the house mouse with the house mouse, the wolf with the she-wolf, etc. Only extraordinary circumstances can alter this boundary rule, and then it only happens under the pressure of captivity or for some other reason that makes mating within the same species impossible. But even then, nature begins to resist with all her might. Again, this naturalistic fallacy is being built up. Her clearest protest is demonstrated in the infertility of the bastard creature or in restricting the fertility of later descendants. In most cases, she deprives them of the ability to resist disease or deprives those unfortunates the means to defend themselves against attacks from enemies. This is natural. And again, I stress, this is also invoking what is called the naturalistic fallacy. Let me pull that up so you can hear what it is. What is the naturalistic fallacy? Okay, so the naturalistic fallacy in metaethics is the claim that it is possible to define good in terms of merely described entities, properties, or processes, such as pleasant, desirable, or fitness. The naturalistic fallacy, according to Wikipedia, is sometimes used to label the problematic inference of an ought from an is. Philosophy terms. Ever heard of the naturalistic fallacy? It's a fancy term for a pretty simple mistake people make. Just because something is common in nature doesn't automatically mean it's good for us to do. For example, noticing that animals don't wear clothes does not imply that we should not wear clothes. Okay, so you get the idea. That which appears in nature is moral by default. There's the actual definition on practical psychology. The naturalistic fallacy is the faulty assumption that everything natural is moral by default, which is not true. But that's what Hitler is appealing to here by strengthening how much nature defends the idea that one species will only mate with another. Now, I'm just going to point out for those of you who don't realize that all of the so-called races of humans are the same species. So there's no violation here. The descendants of mixed races do not have any of the problems that Hitler actually just talked about in terms of lowered fecundity, inability to defend themselves, or any of this stuff. They are not cross-species hybrids. He says every breed, also he's not quite right about the whole thing. I mean, various closely related species do tend to interbreed. I used to be a fisherman many years ago, and it was always fun to go fishing for walleye. But in a lot of lakes where there are walleye, there's a closely related cousin called a sauger. And then you very frequently would actually catch either or both, but you would also catch a hybrid called a saugai. So the interbreeding between them, of course, fish breeding is a little bit different in its mechanism, was actually pretty significant, actually. There's fairly common to catch saugai instead of pure walleye or sauger. And all three taste the same, by the way. They're all in the perch family, if I believe, which means they are very good freshwater fish eating. So he goes on to say, every breeding between two creatures that are not from the same level, whatever level means, produces a result midway between the levels of the two parents. So he's got a rigid hierarchy of the animals baked into his head, the higher animals versus the lower animals. There's no real explanation for what makes a higher animal or a lower animal, and there are lots of interesting biological arguments you could make. But since Hitler was inspired heavily by Darwin and evolution, he's not good with his evolutionary theory, because evolutionary theory posits that every single animal that's alive now, along with every other single living thing, is at the same current stage of evolution. We're all at the current end point of the process, going back to our earliest common ancestors. If you believe the theory of evolution, we could organize them in terms of higher or lower status by their capacity to engage in cognition or abstract cognition or planning or self-recognition or lots of other traits. But this isn't a biological concept, so to speak, or not the way he's talking about. But there are apparently a hierarchy of creatures, as he calls them, creatures, not animals, not very specific. But there are creatures, and there are higher and lower. There's some hierarchy, and that he says every breeding between two creatures that are not from the same level, which is unclear of what that means, because when species are far enough apart, there is no interbreeding, produces a result midway between the levels of the two parents. I bet you he's thinking of mules as the mating between a horse and a donkey, but I'm not quite sure. The offspring, he says, will be on a higher level than the racially lower one of its parents, but not as high as the higher one. So hybrids are somehow averages. This is not good. I'm not a biologist, but this is not to make that joke, but this is not good biology. Consequently, in battle, which is, by the way, if you didn't know, Hitler's entire conception of the world is about battle. In battle, it will eventually yield to the higher species because of its deficiencies. So the hybrid will lose to the superior parent species because it's deficient. You can see where this is going. When you mix races, they are less than, and so they would succumb in battle if you were to, say, send them out into a gigantic, global race war or something. That sort of mating runs counter to nature's will to breed life upward. So now nature has a tendency, or will, actually, nature has a will, which is also not part of evolutionary theory, to breed life upward. That is not correct either. Again, I'm not a biologist, but the point of evolution, if we accept evolutionary theory, is to increase the fitness of a species to its environment, not upward, contingent upon what that environment is. So if it becomes wetter or drier, for example, hotter or colder, more or less radiation from the sun directly falling upon it, or something of this kind, some relocation that changes the external conditions, evolution will favor that which makes the organism more fit to its present environment. That is not upwards in some mythical hierarchy, and nature does not have a will to do this. And the law of, as you would say, competition, or the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, or natural selection, does not have a will to breed life upwards. It has a will to It has no will, actually. That's completely wrong. It has a inexorable and terrible law that the unfit won't survive. So that which is most fit to the environment will do better marginally than that which is less fit to the environment. This is the theory of natural selection for people who don't know it because you studiously avoided learning it. That which is more fit to the environment will outcompete that which is less fit to the environment, and therefore that which outcompetes will eventually be the things that dominate that environment. This isn't a will to breed life upwards. So just setting the table here that Hitler's view, that we don't even have to get into the esoteric side yet. It's just wrong. It's like this antiquated, old-fashioned notion that fed the eugenics programs with a kind of a mythical quality about higher and lower life forms and a rigid hierarchy, but also this will to breed upward. He says nature's will is accomplished by the complete victory of the higher species. Again, higher doesn't make sense. It's fitness to one's environment. Not by uniting superiority and inferiority, as you would with a hybrid in his view. The stronger, he says, must rule. So might makes right. It must not unite with the weaker, thus sacrificing its own higher nature. Only those who are born as the weaker being can think this cruel and let me just read that again. I got the intonation wrong. Only those who are born as the weaker being can think this is cruel, and that is why he is a weak and defective man. So the only people who deny that nature works this way are weak, and they are intrinsically flawed themselves, so obviously we don't have to listen to them. Whereas the woke left tries to make you look morally deficient, intellectually deficient, or crazy, the woke right isn't as concerned typically with intellectual deficiency, though they sometimes get into that with the more intellectual side, but they're very concerned with you being too weak. And so they add this other dimension of discrediting you. He says, if this law did not hold, the evolution of life would be unthinkable. I just explained actually how he got the evolution of life theory wrong. And it is thinkable. It is thinkable that what you move toward is fitness to your environment, not upward superiority. And so he's not quite on it. So let's see. Let's carry on with this jerk. The consequence of this instinct for race purity. So now we have an instinct for race purity that's been conflated from the idea that species mate within themselves because that's how mating works. This consequence of the instinct for race purity, which is found universally throughout nature. Notice he's doing the old-fashioned thing of equating race and species, which is, again, not applicable to the so-called different races of humans. We're all the same species, guys. This consequence of the instinct for race purity, which is found universally throughout nature, naturalistic fallacy, is not only the sharp outward difference between the separate races, but their uniform nature within themselves of their character that is unique to each species. The fox is always a fox, the goose a goose, the tiger a tiger, etc. The only possible difference is in varying degrees of health, strength, understanding, cleverness, and endurance among individual specimens. We will never find a fox which naturally has moments of kindness toward geese, just as there is no cat with a friendly affection for mice. As it turns out, that also is kind of contingent and not totally true, but he's trying to say that there's an intrinsic nature to the different species that is true to that nature and fixed and immovable, and also through the predator-prey model of battle, if you want, there's a hierarchy hidden there. It's not that the goose and the fox are competing and have different strengths and different domains that allows the fox to win the day and eat the goose sometimes, and the goose to outsmart or escape the fox. Other times, it's that the fox is higher than the goose because of its predatory instinct. This is, again, a fallacy of thinking about how specialization across species works. He says the battle is born out of hunger and love, not because of any native hostility. So the fox and geese are at each other because of hunger and love. So the foxes love each other and they go after the geese, which they are hungry to eat, not out of any native hostility. In both cases, nature watches with calm satisfaction. That's not true. Nature does not watch. The struggle for daily bread conquers the weak, sickly, and undecided. It is pagan religion to believe that nature has a will and is a watcher and has satisfaction, even if he's just being poetic. The struggle for daily bread conquers the weak, sickly, and undecided, while the males who win the contest for the female win the right, or at least the opportunity of reproduction for the healthiest individuals. Struggle is the means that improves the health, strength, and stamina of the species, and the reason for its evolution to a higher quality of being. It'd be easier to have just said that nature is hard. If any other process were the choice of nature, again, nature doesn't choose things, all development and evolution would cease and the progress so far achieved. So evolution is progressing somewhere. It's teleological. It has a purpose. It's going somewhere, which is to upwardly lift species and take them to a higher point. Imagine if you were to apply that to humans and try to maybe make the Superman or something. Through a eugenics process where you get rid of all the inferior races and favor one particular race, even if it's not clear what that race is. All the progress so far achieved would reverse if this wasn't the case, he says. There are always more inferior beings than the best examples of a species. That's just a simple law of numbers. The top 10% are the best. And they're outnumbered 9-1 by less than the best. He says this is simply a matter of numbers. Yup. And the fact that only some can be the best among them. Given equal opportunities for survival and reproduction, the worst part of a species would increase so much faster than the smaller number of quality members, until eventually the best would be crowded out into the background. A correction that favors the dominance of the better individual must take place. So there must be something that makes sure that the superior have greater opportunities than the inferior. So are you following where this goes when you apply the logic through eugenics, which he did? Nature, he tells us, takes care of this by subjecting the weaker part to difficult living conditions. That alone is sufficient to restrict their number to some degree. But these cannot be allowed to increase in number randomly. A new ruthless selection method is made, and only the strongest and most sound will make the cut. Nature does not desire the mating of a weaker species with stronger individuals. Species with individuals. Even less does she desire the mixing of a higher race with a lower race. If this were allowed to happen over thousands of years, the effort of natural selection, which he has already explained he doesn't understand, would be for nothing. History shows us countless examples which prove this law. It shows with alarming clarity that every time Aryan blood is mingled with inferior races, the result has been the end of the greater civilization whose members were the flag bearers of superiority. Okay, so now he's gone from talking about foxes and geese to Aryans and inferior races. So we've got the Aryans on the table, so now we've got to talk about the Aryans, and we have to come back to Hitler in a minute. We'll start this paragraph over. So where did the term Aryan come from? Well, it's a word for Persian and Indo-European peoples that's kind of out of fashion, thanks to the Nazis, that not a lot of people used until it was reinvigorated by the grand theosophist Helena Blavatsky, who started the Theosophical Society in London in 1875 and wrote a crackpot book in the 1880s called The Secret Doctrine. She's the one who introduced the concept of the Aryan race. She's the one who introduced the concept of the swastika being the emblem of the Aryan race and a symbol of power, of secret meaning that is indicative of what she called the fifth root race of humanity, or the Aryans. Helena Blavatsky undoubtedly influenced the Nazis and thus Hitler, though not directly, and certainly Hitler did not favor the Theosophists. There are a lot of reasons that could be. So I've said in the past that it did, and that there are rumors, in fact they're written in books, saying that Hitler may well have had a copy of the secret doctrine he kept with him, and that he had read it and studied it, that he kept it even on his nightstand. There are other historical accounts that say this is very unlikely, and in fact maybe impossible. Certainly, Hitler took power in 1933, and in 1935 he banned the Theosophists from Germany. There are reasons why he might have done that. He might have done that because he saw that they were evil and wrong and bad, and he was an anti-Theosophist. He might also have done it because he had a materialist racial concept of what the root races represented that doesn't match with Blavatsky's very spiritualist and very different interpretation. And he didn't want anybody to be able to call him a heretic. That's another possibility. The orthodox view might have contradicted his heterodox view. In either case, it's almost certain that Hitler did not invent the term Aryan or any of this kind of thought. Actually, he got it from other places. He also probably did not get it from Blavatsky, because Blavatsky believed that all human beings alive in the modern world today, with the slight possibility of a few exceptions, are in fact Aryans. Aryan refers to, and it has multiple sub-races that we find as the physical races around the world, or social races if you'd rather, whatever you want to call them. And so Blavatsky believed that, this is a lot to explain and it's not really worth getting into in detail, but she believed that humanity actually goes through, or life on Earth, I should say, goes through 7 rounds of cosmic evolution. Each round takes a very long time, millions or billions of years. And at the end of the 7th round, life will have finally reached its highest attainment and become basically purely spirit and be able to merge back with the all. But we're not in the 7th round. We're not even close. We are in the 4th round. And each round individually has 7 stages that one goes through, which are called the 7 root races of that round. And so Blavatsky believed that we are in the 5th root race, Aryan, of the 4th round. Now, who were the 4th root race who preceded us? She called them the Atlanteans, who lived on Atlantis, which was destroyed some untold long time ago as a lost continent in the Atlantic Ocean. And the 3rd root race preceded them by millions of years and were called the Lemurians. And the Lemurians occupied a secret destroyed continent that was in the Pacific Ocean that does not exist today, millions upon millions of years ago. And so that the point of the 5th root race is to prepare life on Earth to transition into the 6th root race. That's the goal. She never names what the 6th root race is, but she hypothesizes that it will take about 1 million years for it to come about. This isn't what you see, and then it might be 1 billion years before the 5th round begins. She believed that there were what she called, 5th rounders or 6th rounders who came back as spiritual guides to our 4th round world spiritually and inhabited bodies in our time, but they're spiritually far more advanced. The highest she puts is Buddha, who was a 6th rounder of unknown development who has come back to help us silly fourth rounders. And then Jesus was likely also a sixth rounder, though she never specifically says that. But at any rate, this is not what Hitler believed about the Aryans. The Aryans were basically the Nordic and Teutonic Germans and nobody else. Maybe some of the Anglo-Saxons would qualify. That matches more closely with the root race variation on Blavatsky taken up by Theosophist Alice Bailey, which I've talked about previously. But the problem is that, first of all, Bailey hated Hitler from the first day she found out about him. And second of all, she wrote down her stuff after Hitler did. So she couldn't have been the source. So it turns out that there are two other sources that led Hitler to pick up this Aryan ideology. And one of them is a relatively famous philosopher who's British of German ancestry, named Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who in 1899 wrote a book called The Foundations of the 19th Century, which was a racialist book that promoted German ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, and Nordicism. It had this crazy belief that that the Aryans were the people that represented those groups, the Germans, the Teutonics particularly, and the Nordics. And that strongly influenced Adolf Hitler and his Nazi ideology. He actually not only read Chamberlain, but not only read Chamberlain, but he met him, he discussed with him, at least in 1923, and at that meeting, Hitler praised Chamberlain's work and called him Germany's savior. So it's very likely that the majority of this race ideology that he is spouting came from Houston Stewart Chamberlain and the Foundations of the 19th Century. This book is undoubtedly highly influential in having shaped racial policies in the Nazi regime. And it was actually widely read throughout Germany even before the Nazis. Kaiser Wilhelm II distributed copies significantly, for example. If I'm not mistaken, but I'm not positive, I think Chamberlain married or somehow interacted with, otherwise I think married Richard Wagner's daughter, but certainly the Wagner strain of German nationalism, ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, and even Nordicism also would have made it into Hitler. There's another case of a character called List. Let me look up and see if I can find his last name. Because he engaged in a practice called Ariosophy, which is a funny word, which refers to wisdom of the Aryans. And so this is Guido von List and Jorg Lanz von Liebenfels, who are two Austrians who worked primarily in the 1890s through the 1930s, and they are actually the importers, specifically from Blavatsky, of a lot of the symbology. They were very interested in the power of runes and the secret power of runes. They wrote a book about it, List did in particular, the so-called Armanen runes. In 1908, List wrote a book called The Secret of Runes, like I said. And these guys talked about the Aryo-Germans and the Germans specifically as the kind of spiritual Aryans. And they were undoubtedly, literally undoubtedly, Theosophists who read and trafficked heavily with Blavatsky. Now, the question of how much influence List and von Liebenfels had on Hitler is pretty open. He would have probably been familiar, but probably did not engage heavily, except to say that the swastika and the SS emblem were both derived directly from those runes that List was so interested in. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was not himself Ariosophic, I guess. Is that how you would say that? He was not into that. But his work influenced also the Ariosophists like List and von Liebenfels, the Nordic racial superiority and anti-Semitism, German ethno-nationalism, and such, providing a bridge between their ideas. So Hitler would have been familiar with this, particularly the Aryan supremacy and the runic mysticism, the swastika symbolism, the occultism, and all of this, although he wasn't nearly as spiritualist as these guys. If I'm not mistaken, he may have banned these fellows after he took power too. Also the folkish nationalism. And that's kind of the big connection here, is that the Ariosophy was very popular within the broader German folk. And so Hitler, trafficking in common man channels as he did, would have picked it up. So it's not specifically that Hitler got his ideas from Blavatsky, although I'm going to read some things from Blavatsky to show you just how, as we get to parallels, just to show you how close some of the ideas are, indicating there's very likely to be influence. But that influence is probably a result of Chamberlain, who may or may not have been trafficking in Blavatsky's ideas, and these other fellows, the Ariosophists, who also were definitely trafficking in the theosophical ideas. And again, Hitler in 1935 banned theosophy in Nazi Germany, but why he did that isn't necessarily clear. Hitler, we're talking about Hitler. Marx, for his part, for example, drew very heavily off of the spiritualism, as he called it, of Hegel, but wanted to cast down all of that spiritualism to make it more material. So Hitler, having a more materialist, which he channeled into race, interpretation of those ideas, is entirely plausible. And Marx wanted to ban religion, and it wouldn't be surprising that Hitler would want to ban these more spiritual approaches as well, because he was so literally materialist and pragmatic. Okay, so I say that we can go back to what we're talking about, but that's where the Aryan race comes from. It comes from the theosophist, the occult view of race promoted by Helena Blavatsky, through some other race occultists that were tapped into the German folkishness and German anti-Semitism, ethno-nationalism, very important stuff. So the Germans by this point largely regarded themselves, especially if they were Teutonic or Nordic, as being Aryans. So history, Hitler tells us, shows us countless examples which prove this law. The law was that the greater race should not intermingle with the lesser race. It shows us with alarming clarity that every time Aryan blood has mingled with inferior races, the result has been the end of the greater civilization whose members were the flag bearers of superiority. I forgot to mention what the Aryans represent in not Blavatsky, but in whether it's Alice Bailey or any of this Ariosophy, or whether it's in Chamberlain's work, or whether it's in Hitler, the Aryans represent the most superior race of the 20th century. And so they are the vanguard, and actually before, the 500 years before or so, they are the vanguard of creating culture, is what it boils down to. So while Bailey's work doesn't translate over directly, it's instructive. Her view was that the races, just like with Blavatsky, are in root race structure. The first and second root races are basically almost animals. They're not really fully human. The third root race is the Lemurians, but they don't come literally from Lemuria. They are spiritually indicative of the Lemurian culture, which means that they are ideally suited to be workers due to their level of intrinsic spiritual development. And then the fourth root race, as the Atlanteans, are intellectuals, and the fifth root race are the Aryans, who are the mystics and occultists and culturists. They are the ones who are flag setters of culture. They are the ones, like Columbus, who would go to a place, take the risk, and build a civilization by bringing under dominion any natives of lower root race status. And so what Hitler's tapping into is this same idea, which is that there's Aryans and they're out there doing empire and building cultures, and every single time they go out there, they go and they build a great society, then they start mating with the natives, and once they start mingling their blood, everything goes to crap. That's what his argument actually is right there. So he continues, the North American population consists overwhelmingly of Germanic elements, which have mingled, no, not British, which have mingled very little with inferior colored peoples, and shows a very different sort of civilization and culture from Central and South America. In Central and South America, the mostly Latin settlers, meaning people of Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese origin, mingled, sometimes on large scales, with people who were native to the area. This one example by itself clearly and distinctly shows the effects of racial mixture. The racially pure and almost unmixed Germanic peoples of the American continent have risen to become the master of their land. He will remain the master as long as he does not yield to blood pollution by mixing with lesser races. This, by the way, is an argument we hear a lot from the woke right today, who tend to reproduce Hitler's bad and stupid arguments a lot because they believe we have Weimar problems and they require Weimar solutions. And whether they know they're Hitler or not, which some of them undoubtedly do and propagandize from it and others do not, and they follow along, they can easily recreate some of the same arguments. Same conditions, same set of problems, same idiots creating same bad, incorrect solutions. But now we're hearing the basis of the Nazi experiment, a racialist worldview that would organize a racialist state, which we'll talk about in the next episode, and that racialist worldview is based on maintaining the purity of the races so that superior Aryans do not intermingle with inferior other races. Guess which race is super inferior to Hitler? Can you guess? I bet you can. There's a bunch of this chapter about them, more than any other chapter in the whole book, as it turns out. So he continues with his pseudoscience. The result of any crossing of races is this. A decline in the level or quality of the superior race. B, a slow but certain wasting disease of physical and intellectual degeneration begins. To commit such a deviation is nothing more or less than to sin against the will of the eternal Creator, not nature anymore, but God. This action is rewarded with vengeance. In attempting to rebel against the iron logic of nature, man comes into conflict with the principles to which he owes his very existence as a human being. So that's a religious statement. His defiance of nature is bound to lead to his own downfall. This is the basis, by the way, of his racialist worldview. This is what we were discussing, his racialist worldview, which he organized the Nazi Party and the Nazi state around. To this, so if anybody tries to tell you that it wasn't racist, that they were forced into some racial things or it was just a thing of their times, no. It was very eagerly and explicitly racist. The whole program was built around extraordinary eugenics-driven racism. To this, he says, we always hear the arrogant objection of the modern pacifist, which is truly Jewish in its inspiration. Told you I was going to mention them. In fact, this chapter has that word, the J-E-W word, in it more times than any other chapter in the entire book. Wonder what he's going to say, don't you? So we hear this arrogant objection of the modern pacifist, which is truly Jewish in its inspiration and correspondingly stupid. Quote, but man can conquer nature. That's not the usual argument about man conquering nature, just to point it out. It is that Christians at least believe that the earth was given unto us, that we were made separately to the rest of life in an act of special creation, and that God himself commanded us, as is in Genesis, to be fruitful and multiply and to make use of and subdue nature to our uses, not conquer, subdue to our uses. So millions, he tells us, thoughtlessly babble this Jewish nonsense and end by imagining themselves as conquerors of nature, but their only weapon is an idea. And this is such a preposterous one that it would be impossible to imagine the world could exist if it were true. Man has never once conquered nature, but at most has caught hold of it and tried to lift one corner of her giant veil which conceals her eternal mysteries. He is never able to create anything. Well, that's not quite right. He creates his children. He can only discover things. He does not rule nature, but has only learned to dominate some of nature's creatures who lack the knowledge he has gained. Men can also take things within nature and through their ingenuity and labor, fashion them into something that does not appear in nature. You might say that it's not creating something, but in a way it is. It really is bringing into existence a organizational structure of stuff or even ideas themselves that did not previously have expression anywhere and would not have naturally arisen. Even very simple things like raw aluminum does not exist in nature, but yes, you can, lift the corner of the veil and understand how to get to raw aluminum, but it's a process, man. It's not out there. There's so little raw aluminum that there may not be any or just tiny amounts anywhere in nature. Turns out it's more reactive than you think, given it's something that we interact with every day. Anyway, I digress. An idea, he says, cannot conquer the foundations of mankind's growth and his being, since the idea itself depends completely on man. That sounds A, like Marx, and B, like your Christian hairs on the back of your neck should be standing up again. Without man, there can be no human idea in the world. Therefore, the idea is always dependent on the existence of men. Marx gave the same argument, and he in turn is subject to all the laws that created the conditions essential for that existence. There's more to the matter, he tells us. Certain ideas cannot be separated from the man who conceived them. This is particularly true, I'm not sure what they are. This is particularly true, he says, of thoughts which are not based on science, but based on feelings or an inner experience. All these ideas are chained to the existence of the men whose intellectual imagination and creative power spawn the idea and have nothing to do with pure logic. Such ideas represent mere manifestations of feeling, such as ethical and moral concepts, etc. Again, your Christian hairs should be standing up on the back of your neck. The preservation of those particular races and men is the essential element for the existence of the ideas they have created. Do you see where he's going with this? Is that the Aryans come up with all the best ideas, so we have to preserve them as a race and not water them down by mixing them with other races who can't create those ideas. If someone should truly desire with all his heart for the pacifist idea to be victorious in this world, he would happen to do his best in every way to help Germans conquer the world. If the reverse should happen and Germany should be extinguished, the last pacifist would very likely die out with the last German. So he's basically saying the Germans are the most highly elevated people. They're the most pacifistic, even though they're warlike in his intentions and in his program. So we should help the Germans take over the whole world, because otherwise you're not going to be able to have real peace, because somebody will always attack you. But the Germans are of higher culture and wouldn't do that if everybody was just German. Where have we heard that kind of logic before? The communists say the exact same thing, by the way. He says, I say this because the rest of the world has not been so completely fooled as our own people have been by this unnatural and unreasonable pacifist nonsense. Anyone who seriously intended to follow pacifist ideology would have to make up his mind to wage war in order to keep pacifism alive. I'm just going to point out, I'm sure you figured out, what he's saying about pacifism itself isn't totally wrong, but the point is he's strawmanning a bunch of people's views as pacifist when they're actually probably something else. In fact, he tells us this and this alone was what the American world savior, Wilson, meaning Woodrow Wilson, who was first elected president on a peace-at-all-costs platform, the editor tells us, but was first to join the First World War later. In fact, this and this alone was what the American world savior, Wilson, intended, or at least what our German prophets thought he intended, and they believed that through his plans their ideals would be attained. The humane pacifist idea may be a perfectly good one, but only after the most advanced race of men has first conquered and enslaved the world on a scale which makes him the only master of the earth. I'm just going to point out that's the same exact idea, kind of as the communists too. When the communists are in absolute and full control, then there will be no war, there will be no violence, there will be no imperialism after the communists have conquered and enslaved the world on a scale which makes him the only master of the earth. The idea, this is the same idea in Islam too. Islam does not mean peace. Islam means submission. And so when everybody submits to the correct view of Islam, there will be peace and we will have pacifism. So Islam as a kind of proto-fascism makes total sense. The idea will then have no chance to cause harm, he says, when everybody is enslaved except the master race. At least it cannot cause any harm greater than the level it is applied, which will become rare and then impossible once the master race has conquered all. Okay, so Hitler's intentions, if you're not picking up the vibe here, is use the German racialist worldview to create a giant master race nation that will then conquer and subdue and enslave the rest of the world's races and then conquer everything. Are you following me here? Battle first, he says, then afterwards, perhaps, we will see if pacifism works. So let's talk about Daryl Cooper and his bullshit that the war was never intended. Hitler's talking in, again, published in 1925. This is volume 1. It was probably written maybe in 23, way before World War II started. just after World War I ended. And he's already talking about the whole point is to engage in battle to conquer the whole world by creating a pure racial ideology that will lead to a program and a state that will make a pure master race that is sure to win all the wars. It's literally to spark a global war for German dominance because Germans are led to believe that they are the master race who alone have the principles to rule the world, and then there will be peace. Do you understand? So he goes on, battle first, and then afterwards perhaps we'll see if pacifism works. So there's going to be war first. Hell yeah, he's going to take Poland. Hell yeah, he's going to try to conquer Europe and eventually the whole world. He says any other course that does not lead to the strongest race ruling. By the way, him trying to take over Europe and the whole world is what started World War II. That's what it turned out to have been. It even wasn't the Jews. Most of the world didn't know about the Jews. And if they did, they didn't really believe it. And I hate to say it, but probably some of them didn't care. But the fact of the matter is that he was taking over all of Europe when he kept saying he wasn't going to do it, which just turned out to be lies so he could get away with doing it, which is exactly the opposite of what the world's allegedly most honest historian, who's not even a historian, has told us. And here's the logic. Any other course that does not lead to the strongest race ruling mankind means mankind has passed the peak of its development, and the end will not be the reign of any supreme moral idea, but degeneration into barbarism and eventually chaos. Some may laugh at that statement, but our planet moved through space for millions of years without men walking on the surface. Someday it may do so again if people forget nature's laws after they have achieved a higher level of existence. They must not forget that their achievement was due to the recognition and brutal application of the laws of nature and not to following the ideas of a few crazy ideologists. So there's your existential threat motivating his program of conquest. All of humanity is going to fail if we don't have a racialist worldview that conquers the entire world by generating a master race. That's literally the program. And if you want to know how that's going to be done, it's through the brutal application of the laws of nature, TM, as Hitler understands them, which we already heard he doesn't understand them. So he goes on. Everything we admire on this earth today, science and art, industry and invention, is the creative product of just a few peoples, and perhaps originally all of one race. The survival of this whole civilization depends on them. If they are destroyed, the beauty of this earth will be buried with them. No matter how much the soil may influence mankind, remember his blood and soil, so we've now talked about the blood, and he said soil is a secondary influence. No matter how much the soil may influence mankind, the result of that influence will always differ according to the races in question. The infertility of a territory may encourage one race to strive for supreme achievement. Another race may accept bitter poverty and starvation along with all the consequences. The ultimate outcome is determined by the inner natural tendencies of a people and the way they deal with external influences. What brings one race to starvation will train another to work hard. The great civilizations of the past have all been destroyed simply because the original creative race died out as a result of pollution of their bloodlines. So once again, pollution of their bloodlines has killed every successful civilization in the past. In every case, he tells us, the original cause of the downfall has been the failure to remember that all civilization depends on men and not vice versa. In order to preserve a particular civilization, the type of men who created it must also be preserved. See, it's not about values, it's not about understanding the concepts. You have to have the same race of people who created it or it won't work. This is the racialist worldview, or part of it. We've heard more about the racialist worldview here. So we can understand what the Nazi experiment was based on, and thus we can understand why it failed. World conquest, outright, not just racism, but literally racial eugenics in order to produce the master race of German supermen who are going to conquer the world to run it forever. That's literally the program. That's the 1,000-year Reich he promised. He delivered on 12 before he proved that he wasn't such a superman himself. In every case, the original downfall has been the failure to remember that all of civilization depends on men and not vice versa. In order to preserve a particular civilization, the type of men who created it must also be preserved, Hitler tells us, but this preservation is dependent on the inflexible law that it is necessary and just for the best and strongest men to be the victor, and only they have the right to continue. The many who would desire to live must fight. Any man who will not fight for his place in this world of constant struggle does not deserve to live. That's a quote. Even though this may sound harsh, it is the way things truly are. It will be an even harsher fate that befalls the man who believes he can conquer nature, for he only insults her. Suffering, disaster, misfortune, and disease will be nature's response to him. Now, I just remind you, my dear Christians, who might be listening, that you are commanded by your Lord to tend to the weak and the sick and the needy, to the widows, to the orphans. But Hitler doesn't say that. He says that goes against the will of nature, which will then bring suffering, disaster, misfortune, and disease as nature's response. The man's a pagan. The man who makes the mistake of ignoring the law of race, as he calls it, cheats himself of the happiness which is fated to be his. So you remember in the previous things where I explained that fascism sees the people as being intrinsically deserving of superiority for some reason, but that they've been ejected from that by excess tolerance that has tolerated contamination of whatever they are, which could be a nation as a political object, a nation as an ethno-state, or a nation as a cultural object. And I held up the examples specifically of Italian fascism under Mussolini, Nazism under Hitler, and Francoism in Spain as these three examples that bring up what that is. Usually it is always the nation, the rightful inheritance of the nation to its rightful people is lost to excess tolerance and interlopers who have come in. And here you hear it explicitly in terms of the racial world concept or worldview or weltanschauung of the Nazis. The man who makes the mistake of ignoring the law of race cheats himself of the happiness which is fated to be his. You deserve your inheritance based on your superior race, but you don't get it because you were too tolerant of other races. The blood got mixed and you don't get it. So the Nazi program is going to use brutality to make sure the law of nature is followed. In other words, and to preserve the race is going to be its project. And so he says, and thus the sine qua non of all human progress is to preserve the race. He doesn't say to preserve the race. He says, sorry, I messed that up. I completely messed it up. Let me do that whole sentence again. I skipped a line. He blocks the triumphant advance of the greater race. So that's the basis of all human progress right there. The sine qua non of all human progress. Sine qua non is Latin and it means the indispensable ingredient or requirement for. So he blocks the triumphant, the man who ignores the law of race blocks the triumphant advance of the greater race, and thus the sine qua non of all human progress. So all human progress is recognizing the law of race to create the triumphant advance of the greater race. And anybody who's against that is against progress, because he's a progressive. But progress is located in the master race, marching humanity forward through greater and greater culture that the stupid primitive screwheads, as in the other races, can't possibly bring about, and that would cause the downfall of if they were to intermingle. So burdened with humanitarian interests and human sentiment, Hitler tells us, he falls back among the helpless beasts. So you either recognize the triumphant advance of the greater race as the law of race, which is the foundation of all human progress, or you're going to fall back among the beasts because you've been burdened with humanitarian interests and human sentiment, which, of course, the fascists don't like. Caring about other people, even like Jesus commanded, would be exactly the opposite of the law of nature, he says. It is useless, he tells us, to argue over what race or races were the original flag bearers of human civilization and the real founders of everything we consider as the world's humanity. It is simpler to ask this question about the present time. Now, the answer is plain and simple. All human culture, art, science, and invention which surrounds us are nearly exclusive the creative product of the Aryan race, which is this mythical race. It's not clear who it actually refers to, and that moves around, and it could be very spiritualist or very otherwise. But he meant primarily, though not entirely, white people. Anglo-Saxons, Teutonics, and Nordics at kind of the highest. This very fact, he tells us, justifies the deduction that the Aryan alone was the founder of a superior type of human life and is the prototype of what we mean by the word man today. He is the Prometheus of humanity, from whose brilliant mind the divine spark of genius has always sprung, ever rekindling the fire which, in the form of knowledge, has illuminated the night of unspeakable mysteries, and thus sent man up the road to lordship over the other creatures of this earth. I'll just let you stew on that particular metaphor. By the way, Karl Marx also venerated Prometheus. Take him away, and perhaps within a few thousand years, profound darkness will descend again upon earth. Human civilization will vanish, and the world will become a desert. That's what will happen if we get rid of the Aryans, apparently. If we were to divide humanity into three classes, the founders of civilization, the maintainers of civilization, and the destroyers of civilization, the Aryan would be the only possible representative of the first class, which are founders of civilization. He laid the foundation and built the great walls of all human creations, and only the outward shape and color are determined by the particular characteristics of the individual peoples. It is the Aryan who furnished the great building stones and plans for all human progress. He's a progressive. And only the execution depends on the character of the various races. Within a few decades, the whole of Eastern Asia, for example, will call a single culture its own. However, this culture is not its own creation, but was built on the foundation of Hellenistic spirit, which is built on Greek achievement. But it was also built with Germanic technology, just as in our own case. So here we have a mythology not just of the past, the mythic past of the German as the Aryan, but also as the ideological, or the ethnic really, but ideological foundation for which all of the developed world is going to be. Only the outward form, he says, will show traits of Asian character. The foundation is Aryan. It is not true that Japan is superimposing European technical progress on her own civilization, as many people assume. Original European science and technology have long been decorated with Japanese style. The basis of life in Japan is not the product of a purely native Japanese civilization, but is instead built on the tremendous scientific and technical work from Europe and America, that is to say, from Aryan peoples. I don't know if he's been to Japan, but yeah, they're very productive in ways that Westerners would recognize, and they built lots of cool things and Western things and things. But man, it's not Western, and we are many decades down from the 1920s, or a century later, and Japan is still culturally very distinct. And that's why they took so many damn COVID shots, because culturally, in Japan, they do not have a very, cough, Aryan view of the world. They are actually very obedient to their government. It is shameful in Japanese culture to disobey your government. So they took lots of shots for the COVID-19 that they didn't need. Anyway, that's just more Hitler's wrong. But anyway, he says, however, this civilization does choose the color of their contemporary life, which, because of the inner differences of the culture, is more obvious to the European who sees the outside. Only by integrating these Aryan achievements can the Orient take a place along with the other countries in general human progress. Aryan scientific and technical achievements provide the foundation that supports their general life and struggle for daily bread in Japan. Only the outward decoration has gradually changed to fit the Japanese character. So what's actually happened, contrary to Hitler's mythology here and whatever, is that for various reasons, which might actually to a degree include, genetic dispositions towards certain amounts of intellect for various reasons, but for some set of reasons, the scientific revolution took place in Europe, which gave it a massive advantage over setting the trends of the technical world. But the reason the science spread so much is not because of Aryan race, it's because it fucking works. It actually works. It actually gets right answers. And anybody, which is virtually everybody, who cares about getting right answers to technical questions about the world in which they live is going to adopt that technology as it comes along. And so once they realize it. So I don't know why it turns out that the Japanese or the Chinese or the Africans or the Americans, Native Americans for that matter, never discovered, or never were not, I shouldn't say never discovered, were not the ones who initiated the set of things that led to the scientific revolution. There are strong reasons to believe that it comes out of the not just Christian context of the European milieu, but also of the strong turn that Thomas Aquinas took back toward general revelation and the relevance of general revelation. But paganism, including in Germany in the 1920s when this was being written, was still massively practiced. And the pagans, by the way, never frickin' succeeded in building anything either. And so this is all rather silly. All these pagan Aryans were not building master technologies. They might have gone and by the sword conquered other tribes and other lands, but they didn't build massive technologies. The scientific revolution, which came about for philosophical and religious reasons in Europe, given whatever variety of conditions, which may also have included something to do with nutrition, sprung that into being, and it happened to happen in Europe. It didn't happen in Asia. The reason may be as simple as necessity is the mother of invention, and there was some reason why necessity spoke to answering these questions. It could have been that curiosity was satisfied by the civil order of the day, by being able to, pay for what amounted to early scientists. It could have been a lot of things, but this Aryan crap is just mythology. But he continues, if starting today all future Aryan influence on Japan were to end, as if Europe and America were both destroyed, Japan's present advance in science and technology might continue for a short while, but within a few years the well would run dry. So just a minute ago he said that it's actually that the core of the Japanese is now Aryan for the adoption of Aryan technologies, and they only put an external superficial veneer on it, but now he's saying that they're not racially Aryan, so they're not going to carry it on. Because the well would run dry if there wasn't more Aryan stuff pouring into Japan. He says the Japanese internal character would gain hold again, and the present civilization would become stagnant and would sink back into the sleep that it was awakened from 7 decades ago by the wave of Aryan civilization. Just as the present Japanese development and culture owes its existence to the influence of Europe and America, we can also be assured that in the distant past, an outside influence, an outside culture brought into existence the Japanese culture of that day. The best proof of this is the fact that their culture later suffered stagnations and paralysis when the influence stopped. So he's saying, by the way, that the Japanese never figured anything out on their own, but they just stole from other people, and then that fell away, and they lapsed back into primitive screwhead land. He said, and it remained this way until it was revived 7 decades ago. This can happen to a race if the original creative core has been lost, or if the outside influence which supplied the stimulus and the materials for the first cultural development is removed. If it is known that a race receives and absorbs the fundamental substance of a civilization from alien races, and progress comes to a halt each time that external influence ceases, the race may indeed be called a sustainer of civilization, but never a creator. So I want you to pause for a second and think about what he's actually talking about. So if you get rid of the essential core of the Aryan creative class, or that stops feeding your other culture, it's going to descend back. So what he's saying is that there's a deep racial essentialism here, to where there are intrinsic traits to each race that define what makes them superior and inferior. This is at the heart of the racialist world concept that we're discussing today of the Nazi experiment, is this fundamental racial essentialism is the right term for it, whether people like that term or not. And again, I hear some of this reproduced on the woke right, particularly with the race and IQ discussions, or race realism discussions, just to point that out. So examination of the various peoples from around the world from this standpoint shows that almost none of them are creators. They are all nearly always sustainers. They are merely the recipients of another culture. By the way, he's going to also argue that this is what Jews do. All inferior races are incapable of creating. Only Aryans can create. That's Hitler's belief in his racialist worldview. So Aryans need to be expanded and concentrated, and in fact enhanced, to continue that going. He says this is usually how their development occurs. Often, amazingly small groups of Aryan tribes overpowered other peoples and caused the dormant intellectual and organizing powers of the conquered people to surface. So they were a bunch of primitive screwheads until the Aryans showed up in small numbers, conquered them, and that made them more productive and more organized, because then they could exercise Aryan technology, basically, only under Aryan discipline. And so conquering inferior peoples and imposing Aryan discipline on them is part of this worldview. Those abilities, he said, were unexercised until the Aryans awoke these abilities in the lesser race. The benefits of the particular living conditions in the new territory, such as the fertility of the soil, climate, etc., made it possible for them to accomplish this cultural awakening by using the large number of available workers from the inferior race. Okay, so it's built on slavery. Often, which is, he's arguing, just and right. The inferior races should be enslaved by the Aryans in order to bring something out, and it's good for the enslaved because it's awakening their latent capacities that they will not be able to maintain without Aryan discipline, which here literally means slavery. He says often in only a few thousand, or maybe even just a few hundred years, they build up civilizations which originally displayed every inner mark of their founder's character, but were adapted to fit within the special qualities of the local area and the characteristics of the subjugated people. But eventually the conquerors violate the first principle, which is keeping their blood pure and not mixing with lower racial stock. They begin to interact with the conquered inhabitants, and in doing so put an end to their own existence. Even for the original sin of man, the penalty was expulsion from paradise. So he's very artfully and playfully or politely saying that they start having babies with the natives and pollute their own bloodline, the original sin being sex, and the penalty is the expulsion from paradise. So when you mate with the lesser beings that are your conquered inferior races, according to Hitler, you contaminate your own bloodline and everything falls apart. After 1,000 years or more, he says, the last visible trace of the former ruling people appears only in the lighter skin coloration that its blood bestows upon the subjugated race. It is a stagnated culture of which the Aryans had been the true founder. Just as the physical and spiritual aspects of the conqueror were submerged, spiritual aspects being Aryan, by the way, were submerged and lost in the blood of the conquered race, so too was the fuel for the torch of human cultural progress extinguished. So only Aryans are capable of cultural progress, by the way, is his message. And once they intermingle, they lower themselves through hybridization and can no longer engage in that, and the whole society is going to fall apart. And the reason is because blood, genetics. The blood of the former masters, he says, has left a faint glow in the complexion as a sign by whitening them up a little bit, because white people are the Aryans, by the way. And the night of the inferior cultural life is gently illumined by the surviving creations of the ancient bringers of that light. They shine throughout the uncivilized state and can easily make the observer who passes by think he is looking at the image of the present people, but he is just looking into the mirror of the past. He actually sees the glow radiated from the original bearers of the fire of culture. So man becomes Prometheus to these primitive screwheads. It may be that throughout history, such a people have come into contact a second time, or even more often, with the race that once brought it civilization. without any surviving memory of this past. Unconsciously, the small shred of the old master's blood which remains will be drawn toward the newly arriving race, and what had originally been possible only by force may now happen through free will. A new wave of civilization explodes and lasts until those who carry the mantle of progress are adulterated and again go down in the blood of alien peoples. Are you understanding what the racialist worldview is? I hope you are understanding. Do not pollute the blood of the Aryans because they carry culture, and if their blood is commingled with the blood of what he calls inferior races, they won't be able to produce culture and civilization will fall apart. He says it will be the responsibility of those who study future cultural and world history to make their discoveries from this point of view and not to smother themselves in descriptions of outward events, as our present historical scientific education does too often. Even this short sketch of the development of cultural sustaining nations also reveals the growth, work, and decline of the real culture founders of this earth, the Aryans themselves. So remember, his program is that they're going to brutally apply this racial purity standard to all people, and after they brutally apply it, they're going to use that in battle to have conquest, to conquer the world, at which point there will be peace around the world in kind of Islamic fashion, and that is the racial world concept. But do you think Hitler stops here? No, he rambles forever. Just as in daily life, the one we call a genius needs a special occasion or even a regular jolt to cause him to shine. A race of people also needs such a jolt to bring out the dormant genius. In the monotony of daily life, even outstanding men may appear insignificant. They never rise above the average level of those who surround them. But take that same person and let him face a situation where others would give up or freeze in fear, and the genius rises visibly out of this unnoticed average man, often to the astonishment of everyone who knows him in his everyday life. This is why the prophet is seldom thought about much in his own country. I don't think it is. There is no better opportunity to observe this man than in war. In times of testing and trial, when others surrender to despair, those who are apparently innocent children spring up into heroes, headstrong in determination and ice-cold in judgment. If the hour of stress had not been inflicted, no one would have dreamed that inside that beardless boy was a young hero. Some sort of impact is almost always necessary to arouse the genius. The hammer blow of fate will knock one man down and strike against steel in another. Once the everyday outer shell breaks, the hidden core is exposed to an astonished world. Then the world cringes, refusing to believe that what had seemed to be a man of its own average rank is now suddenly a greater being. The process occurs almost every time an outstanding son of the race appears. Remember, he's talking about the cultural makers, the cultural sustainers. We have not yet got to the cultural destroyers. I dare you to guess who they are. Although an inventor does not establish his greatness until the day his invention is created, it is a mistake to think that genius itself had never taken hold of the man until then. The spark of genius exists in the brain of a truly creative and gifted man from the hour of his birth. True genius is always present from birth and never taught or learned. This applies, as I've already emphasized, not only in the individual, but in the entire race. So as above, so below, or something. Actively creative peoples have fundamental creative gifts from the beginning, even though the outside observer may not recognize it. Outward recognition only results from the accomplishment because the rest of the world is not capable of recognizing genius by itself. They only see its visible expression in forms of inventions, discoveries, buildings, pictures, etc. Even then, it may take a long time before the world recognizes the genius that drove the accomplishment. Just as the genius or outstanding individual man with extraordinary talent is unable to bring out his ability until it is set in motion by a particular stimuli, a race is only able to bring out its creative powers and abilities when the right conditions stimulate the peoples into action. These abilities are clearest in the race which has been and is the bearer of human cultural development, the Aryans. What is human cultural development? Progress. So who are the progressives? The Aryans. The moment fate imposes special conditions on them, their inborn abilities surface at a quicker pace and their genius is shown through the physical result. Their cultures they create are almost always determined by the soil, the climate, and the conquered people. The last of these elements is the most important, blood and soil. The more primitive and greater the technical limitations of any acquired culture, the more effort will be required for the civilizing activity, and therefore the more manpower will be needed. When the manpower is organized, concentrated, and applied, it can substitute for the power of mechanical machines. Without the availability of lower-ranked men, the Aryan could never have taken the first step toward his later civilizing of those peoples. So he needs the sympathizers, let's try to use polite terminology, in order to help whip the colonized into shape. It is the same as if he had never tamed and used various domesticated animals to help build the foundation of civilization. Then he would never have arrived at a level of technical development which is now gradually permitting him to do without those very animals. The saying, the Moor, M-O-O-R, that's Arab, has finished his job, so now let him depart. It's not really Arab, but it's Muslims from North Africa. The Moor has finished his job, so now let him depart, which is a paraphrase, it says here, from Shakespeare's Othello, but is also attributed to the German poet Schiller. The Moor has finished. The saying, the Moor has finished, so let him now depart, has an unfortunate meaning which is deeply true today. For thousands of years, the horse was forced to serve man and help him lay the foundations of a civilization. Now, thanks to the automobile and mechanical devices, the horse himself has become unnecessary. Within a few years, the horse will no longer be used, but without his help in days gone by, man would have had difficulty in arriving where he is today. Okay, so what are we talking about? But we're not talking about horses, we're talking about the Moor. So we're talking about the inferior race has done his job, so now let him depart. Let's get rid of him. We used him, we didn't need him anymore, get rid of him, send him back. That's like basically our whole friggin' immigration program or something. So therefore, he tells us, the availability of inferior races was one of the most important elements in the formation of higher cultures. Their labor, so he wasn't talking about horses, he's telling you that now. Their labor could compensate for the lack of technical tools and machines, without which advanced development is unthinkable. Without question, the first civilization of humanity depended less on domesticated animals and more on the use of racially inferior human beings. So you start with slaves and you replace them with animals that you eventually get to replace with machines. That's his theory of history. It was the enslavement, he argues, of conquered races which occurred first. So I wasn't exaggerating. Only later did animals find the same fate and not the other way around, as many people would like to think. First it was the conquered man who drew the plow, and only later did the horse take his place. Only whining fools and pacifists, remember that's his enemy, can consider this fact a sign of human degradation. This progression had to take place in this order so man could finally arrive at a point where these apostles can stand up and make the world listen to their crowing. So what he's saying is that the slaves should shut the hell up, or descendants of slaves, because the only reason we were able to build an advanced society first was on their backs, which were replaced by animals, which have been replaced by machines. So he says this isn't human degradation, this is human advancement. So if you recall in the past that I said that the communists look at subjugation or oppression and say this is the state of society, its ordering principle, its fundamental organizing principle, and it is bad, so we will take over to do away with it. And the fascists look on and say, no, actually, you're right, oppression is the fundamental organizing principle of society, but it is good and it's what got us here, so we're going to be grateful to it and we're going to continue to enforce the fundamental hierarchy that got us to this position. And then he says at the end, what are these apostles? So the descendants of slaves, as he calls whining fools and pacifists, can only be whining fools and pacifists now because they were slaves in the past and we got to where we are so that they are in a position to be comfortable enough to turn around and whine and moan. We never would have got there without it. Mankind's progress, he says, is like climbing an endless ladder. To climb higher, you must first climb over the lower rungs. Therefore, the Aryan had to follow the road required by reality and not that road dreamed up in the imagination of the modern pacifist. The road of reality is harsh and difficult, but it is the only one that finally leads where the pacifist dreams mankind should be. But in reality, he is removing the possibility of achieving that dream. The real truth is that those dreamers only lead man away from his goal, not toward it. So more oppression is good. The hierarchy is what needs to be artificially enforced so that the so-called law of nature is maintained, so that the purity of the race can be advanced, so that you can conquer the world and then you can have peace. It is no accident. That's why the pacifist, who he's whining about now, should join the German. That's what he said before. It is no accident that the first civilizations arose where the Aryan encountered and conquered lower races and made them do his will, aka enslave them. The inferior races were the first mechanical tools to serve a dawning civilization. This is literally taking the argument from the Marxists about imperialism and colonialism, by the way, and saying it backwards. The road which the Aryan must travel was clearly marked. As a conqueror, he defeated the inferior peoples and controlled their physical labor under his orders, according to his will and for his purposes, slavery. In putting them to a useful but hard task, here's where he argues, like Doug Wilson used to argue, that slavery is good for the slaves. It is in putting him to a useful but hard task, he has not only spared the lives of the conquered, but gave them a fate that was actually better than their previous so-called freedom. As long as he ruthlessly maintained a master's attitude, he remained not only the real master, but he preserved and advanced the new civilization. This new civilization depended entirely on his inborn abilities and on the survival of the Aryan race. When those who had been conquered began to advance themselves, possibly to the level of using their conqueror's language, the sharp split between master and servant disappeared. The Aryan surrendered the purity of his blood by intermingling. Historically speaking, they probably did that on the first night they got the opportunity. I'm just going to point that out. The Aryan surrendered the purity of his blood by intermingling and lost the right to paradise, which he had made for himself. His racial purity declined as it mixed with the native races, and gradually he lost more and more of his cultural creativity, until finally he began to resemble the natives more than his own forefathers, both mentally and physically. For a time he could still live on the cultural substance he had built, but then stagnation set in, and finally oblivion claimed his race. That's Hitler's race theory. So this is, remember, we're still talking about the culture sustainers. We have talked about the culture builders of the Aryans, and now we're talking about the culture sustainers still, and what pollutes them is this intermingling with the inferior races. And then civilization is destroyed by that. The ultimate result, he tells us, is that civilization and empires collapse to make way for new structures. Mixing of blood and the decline in racial quality that it causes is the main reason for the dying out of old cultures. Civilizations are not destroyed by war, but because they lose that stamina inherent in a pure bloodline. So this is him believing that if you have a pure bloodline, everybody's kin, and therefore everybody's going to fight more vigorously for themselves, plus maintaining a standing of higher quality. Anything in this world that is not of sound racial stock is a useless husk which is blown away in the wind. So ask yourself what Hitler really thought about race in the early 1920s, which is the opposite of what the woke right propagandists are telling us. Every event in world history, Hitler says, is an expression of the racial interest for self-preservation, whether for prosperity or for suffering. Notice that's intrinsically identity politics, where there are racial identity classes that are constitutive of nations that have their own inheritances, but they're also hierarchically organized according to their superiority or inferiority, which the white Aryans are at the top of. The question, he says, of why the Aryan is so important is found in how his instincts are expressed, and not because he has a stronger instinct for self-preservation. The individual's will to live is equally great everywhere. Only the actual form it takes will vary. In the most primitive creatures, the instinct of self-preservation does not go beyond caring for itself. The selfishness extends to include time, so that the immediate moment is the most important and nothing is planned for the future. In this state, the animal lives for itself alone, seeks food when it is hungry, and fights only when it is forced to defend its own life. As long as the instinct of self-preservation takes this form, there is no basis to form a community or even a primitive family. Once the partnership between male and female becomes a true partnership, not just for the purposes of mating, it then requires that self-preservation instinct be extended. The care and struggle for only self now extends to protect the mate. The mate often hunts for food, but when a child is produced, they both work to feed their young. One will almost always fight to defend the other. This exemplifies the first forms of self-sacrifice, even though this is infinitely primitive. When this feeling spreads beyond the limits of the immediate family, we have the essentials required for the formation of larger groups and finally of nations. In the most primitive men on earth, this quality is present only to a very limited degree, often not going beyond the formation of the family. As the willingness to put aside purely personal interests increases, the more advanced the ability to set up extensive communities will become. The will to sacrifice, to devote personal labor, and if necessary, life itself to others, is most highly developed in the Aryan. So this is great, right? So the Aryan are the people that understand, like Jordan Peterson says, that the fundamental principle of civilization is voluntary self-sacrifice. But you're going to find out very quickly that that's not what Hitler actually is advocating. It sounds that way so far, but it's something else. He says the Aryan's greatest power is not in his mental qualities necessarily, but in the extent of his readiness to devote all his abilities to the service of the community. Oh, he's a communist. In him, the instinct of self-preservation can reach its noblest form because he willingly subordinates his own ego for the prosperity of the community and is even willing to sacrifice his own life for it if necessary. So there's a lot getting mixed up there. The reason for the Aryan's constructive ability, and especially his ability to create civilizations, does not lie in his intellectual gifts. If he had only intellectual abilities, they might easily be destructive and he would never be able to organize and build. The essential character of the individual depends on his ability to forfeit his personal opinions and interests and to offer them instead for the service of the community. Not anything intrinsically wrong with that except when it's compelled. Only by serving his community and assuring its prosperity does he receive his own rewards. He no longer works only for himself, but takes his place within the structure of the community, not only for his own benefit, but for the benefit of all. The most wonderful demonstration of this spirit is through work. He understands that his labor is not just for his livelihood, but his labor serves the interests of the community without conflicting with the community's interests. Otherwise, the goal of his work is only self-preservation without consideration for the welfare of the community. In such a case, his work for his own self-interest would properly be called theft, robbery, burglary, or usury. That's interesting. The spirit of placing the community's prosperity before the self-interests of one's own ego is the first essential element for every truly human culture. This spirit alone has brought about the greatest works of humanity. It brings only a small reward to the originator, but rich blessings to future generations. So that is what he says the Aryan possesses especially, but that's what inferior races therefore lack, and that's what the purpose of the Aryan's enslavement is to organize them, to get them against their own interests and will to work for the community in his vision, which of course often means for himself, as those economies typically favor the slave class very, very well, and the slaver class very, very well, the slave holding class, but not the slave class very much at all. This alone, he says, makes it possible to understand how so many people can bear a shabby but honest life filled with nothing but poverty and insignificance. They know they are laying the foundation for the existence of the community. Again, these are communitarians. I said communists earlier, but communitarian is what he means by Aryan is communitarians, including the selfish grifter ones. Every workman, every peasant, every inventor, every civil servant who labors without ever attaining happiness and prosperity is a pillar of this high ideal, even though the deeper meaning of his actions are forever hidden from him. Sounds like a joyful existence he's going to force his people into. What is true about work as the basis of human survival and of all human progress is true to an even higher degree when it is done for the protection of man and his civilization. The surrender of one's own life for the existence of the community is the height of all self-sacrifice. Yes, that's why we honor our fallen. That's why we celebrate Memorial Day. That's correct. Only in this way can we assure that what we have built is not destroyed by nature or human hands. Our German language has a word that precisely and splendidly describes that principle. Pflichterfüllung or something, or performance of duty. That means service to the common good of the community ahead of personal self-interests. The fundamental spirit that creates this action is what we call idealism. So realism is out, idealism is in. It is the opposite of egotism or selfishness. No, it's in fact the opposite of reason and faith. It means exclusively the individual's ability to sacrifice himself for the community, for his fellow men. This sounds very much similar to communism, guys. It is necessary for us to realize that idealism is not superficial emotional gut reaction or humanitarianism, but that it is, was, and always will be the necessary precondition for what we call human civilization. It is the source that provides meaning to the word human. Idealism is. So humans are naturally idealists. That's what makes us human. So we can envision the ideal and try to bring it into the world, which is what Marx said. To this spirit, the Aryan owes his position in the world, and to the Aryan, the world owes the creation of mankind. For this spirit alone shaped a creative force from a pure mind, which was a unique marriage of muscular power and great intellect, and this built the monuments of human civilization. So the alpha of humanity are the Aryans. I wonder what the omega of humanity are. I bet it's the Aryans. Without its idealistic spirit, all the mental capabilities of the mind, no matter how brilliant, would remain... Without its idealistic spirit, all the mental capabilities of the mind, no matter how brilliant, would remain mere inner thoughts or technical knowledge without any outward expression of their inner value, and therefore it would never become a creative force. This is similar to Marx's dialectic of subject and object, by the way. True idealism is the subordination of one's self, the individual's interest and life, to the community, which is in accordance with the ultimate will of nature. This is the first essential element for the development of any kind of organization. Remember, he very much portrayed a brutal survival of the fittest, and now it's survival of the community. So we went from rampant survival of the fittest being the principle down to communitarianism being the principle of nature. This is the first essential element for the development of any kind of organization. It leads men voluntarily to recognize the dominance of power and strength and makes them into grains of sand within the realm of creation from which the whole universe is made. The purest idealism unconsciously becomes the perfect counterpart to the most profound wisdom. So let us not be mistaken. The Nazi world project is idealist. It is not realist. It is not based on reality, no matter how many times he says reality. It is ultimately idealist. So the racial world concept is the idealized race, which will be the idealized master race that will conquer the world and bring peace to everybody. And you achieve it through brutal application of this communitarian law of nature and the racial law of nature. This is the Nazi experiment in its eugenic program. We can immediately see how true this is and how little genuine idealism has to do with a fantasy utopia by asking an unspoiled child, a healthy boy for instance. The boy can listen to the rantings of an idealistic pacifist without understanding a word he says, but the same boy will immediately be ready to turn on his heel and sacrifice his young life for the ideal of his people. This willingness results from an instinct in the unconscious which obeys a deeper understanding, the need to preserve the species at the expense of the individual if necessary. He naturally protests against the prophetic speech of the pacifist who tries to disguise himself as something other than the selfish coward that he is, and he is constantly seeking ways to violate the laws of nature. It is a necessary part of human evolution that the individual has a spirit of self-sacrifice which favors the prosperity of the community and not on the disgusting dreams of the cowardly wise guys and critics who pretend to know more than nature and seek to violate her decrees. There's a whole lot of stuff that's correct wrongly in there that would take a while to unpack, but I think you're smart enough and you've got it. When self-interest threatens to replace idealism, we notice an immediate weakening in the force that maintains the community. When the community breaks, so falls civilization. Once we let self-interest become the ruler of a people, the bonds of social order are broken. When a man focuses on chasing his own happiness, he falls from heaven straight to hell. So the Aryans are ones who can discipline themselves that way, but also who can be in positions of authority to discipline other people not to be that way. Thus you see these encroachments, say, from the Christian nationalists. Stephen Wolfe has been very clear, the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism, has been very clear in saying that there need to be punishments in order to maintain the public good and the health of the public's souls, that there need to be blasphemy laws, anti-heresy laws, there need to be like all kinds of restrictions on speech, especially in institutions. Public heresy should be punished. Atheism, he says, will be crushed repeatedly. And he's therefore placing himself in the driver's seat of that enlightened elect class, which you could call the Aryans if we're following Hitler, who believe that they know how to order other men for their own good. Because if you don't, when man focuses on chasing his own happiness, the pursuit of happiness being one of the foundations of Jeffersonian liberalism, by the way, he falls from heaven straight into hell. Future generations do not remember the men who pursued their own self-interests, but they glorify the heroes who sacrificed their own happiness. Can we talk for a minute about men who pursued their own self-interests like Thomas Edison? It doesn't matter if you think he was a bad guy. You know who he was, don't you? Yeah, he's the most famous inventor of all time, allegedly. So no, it turns out that rational self-interest is pretty good sometimes. You don't have to be this rampant communitarianism. We do remember people that are heroes like Winston Churchill who sacrificed greatly for the good of his own people. We also remember villains who thought they were doing this like Adolf Hitler. Okay, so we're about to have a change in tone. I know this is long, but this is a long chapter. It's all long. I'm sorry. So we've talked about the culture creators, who are the Aryans, and the culture sustainers are the people that are under the dominion of Aryans or partially interbred sub-Aryans. But we haven't talked about the culture destroyers, except to mention that it's the inferior races getting too much power, or actually more importantly, the Aryans, the descendants of the Aryans who have mingled too much blood, become the culture destroyers. Right, so the subjugated peoples by the Aryans are the cultural sustainers, and they can only do that as long as they have the culture creators, the Aryans, there. But we haven't fully talked about who really destroys culture, and like I said, I bet you can guess who it is. The most extreme contrast to the Aryan, we are told, is the Jew. Now, this is a point of departure from Blavatsky, who considered the so-called Semitic peoples, including Jews, not to be inferior to Aryans. They were Aryans as well, as all modern humans are, but they were they represent a lower state of spiritual evolution than Christians and people who have abandoned Christianity for kind of New Age or theosophical spiritual truths. So for Blavatsky, technically the Jews were Aryans, but they were like kind of lower level in spiritual development because Judaism got superseded by Christianity, gets superseded by New Age theosophy that recognizes that Christ was just one with Christ consciousness among many, which represents being like somebody from a later stage of development. So this doesn't, what I'm saying is Hitler's view here matches probably with Chamberlain's and certainly with List's, but it doesn't match with and with a lot of German folk thought and anti-Semitism and ethno-nationalism as it was, but it does not match with Blavatsky specifically in her importation of the concept of Aryan into European cultural thought. So the most extreme contrast to the Aryan is the Jew, although Blavatsky didn't like Jews either very much. The self-preservation instinct, he tells us, is developed more strongly in the so-called chosen people than in any other people in the world. The best proof of this is the mere fact that the race still exists. What other people have undergone so few changes of mind and character in the last 2,000 years as the Jew? Notice also that he's also alluding to the fact that they haven't been killed or crushed. The Romans weren't able to destroy them. All of their Old Testament enemies were not able to destroy them, and nobody had been able to destroy them. He says, what people have gone through greater upheavals and yet have always come through the most tremendous catastrophes of humanity unchanged? He says that like it's a bad thing. An infinitely tenacious will to live and to preserve one's species is demonstrated by this fact. The intellectual qualities of the Jew have been trained through thousands of years. He is considered cunning today, and in a certain sense always has been. But his intellectual ability is not the product of his own evolution, but of object lessons from others. So he's not a superior race. He's stealing from others. The human mind cannot climb without steps on which to stand. The spirit requires successive steps to climb upward. Every upward stride needs a foundation, one which is laid in the developments of the past, and this can only be found in a civilization of people. Knowledge rests only to a small degree on one's own experience and predominantly relies on the accumulated past experiences and knowledge of others. The general level of civilization provides the individual with this wealth of preliminary knowledge, which allows him to easily take further steps of progress on his own. Let me just point out how progressive this is. This is progressive eugenics, like no joke. This is primarily done without the individual even being aware of it, just like what's also being done without the individual being aware of it is when the woke right is copying these progressive arguments, thinking they are just reactionary or right-wing. The boy of today, Hitler tells us, for instance, grows up surrounded by an absolute multitude of technical achievements from past centuries. He takes these achievements for granted without noticing things that only 100 years ago were a mystery to the greatest minds. However, these achievements are critically important to him if he is ever to understand our progress in a certain area or to improve upon it. If a genius from the 1820s were suddenly to return from the grave today, he would encounter a monumental intellectual adjustment before he could hope to understand our present time. Facing a new piece of technology would be more difficult and confusing for the genius than it is for the modern average 15-year-old boy. This genius would lack all the endless preliminary knowledge which the present-day population absorbs automatically as they grow up among the technological products of their particular civilization. I feel like saying okay boomer here for some reason. For reasons which will be immediately apparent, the Jew has never possessed a culture of his own, and the basis for his knowledge has always been furnished by the civilizations of others. This is straight out of Blavatsky, actually, although how it got to Hitler, I don't know for sure. In every age, his intellect has developed by using the civilization surrounding him. In fact, Blavatsky argues that they ripped off the Egyptian hieroglyphs and turned them into the Hebrew characters, and stole the Egyptian culture and pretended it was theirs as they went off to wander in the desert. In every age, his intellect is developed by using the civilization surrounding him. The reverse of that process has never taken place. The self-preservation instinct of the Jewish people is greater than that of other peoples. Even if their intellectual powers at first appear to be equal to other races, they completely lack the all-important requirement of a civilized people, the spirit of idealism. Now that's profound, but we're going to come back to Blavatsky for a second after this. That is profound. The thing that makes Jews different to the Aryan and bad is that they are not idealists. They believe in realism rather than idealism. They accept the law and the covenant upon which it is, and they live in this world rather than in idealism. They live within the world rather than trying to change the world to suit them. So that's what the problem with Jews is. If you wondered, what's the big problem with Jews? Now you know. That's the answer. They completely lack the all-important requirement of a civilized people, the spirit of idealism. Their religion fundamentally sets them apart from megalomaniacs. That's why anti-Semitism, in not all, but so many cases, because they believe in reality and they will say no to all this crazy idealistic nonsense. They will not go along. They will not sacrifice who they are as a people, which is the covenant with their God, to go along with the community standards of a crazy idealistic project. Therefore, they are a problem. That's why. And that hurts all the people. That's why they're a pestilence or a disease, because it shows people a different alternative to getting swept along with the madness of the tyrants or the zeitgeist or whatever it happens to be. It's their willingness and ability to stand apart from the current of, I guess zeitgeist is the right word, that and be who they really are in their actual culture, he says that they don't have, that makes them who they are. And that's what makes them anathema to the quote-unquote Aryan, who is an idealist and a progressive. It is the fact that Jews are not that inherently. And when they're religious, they are certainly not. But Hitler sees them not in a religious sense, but as a race, not as a religion. So let's go back to Blavatsky real quick. If I think I have this Hebrew thing, I don't remember if I have. I have two things that I cut from there. Let's see, invented a temptation, Brahmin, something. Maybe this isn't the time for this. The glyphs of the Jews and even their language, the Hebrew, are not original. They are borrowed from the Egyptians, from which Moses got his wisdom, from the Coptic, the probable kinsman, if not parent, of the old Phoenician, and from the Hyksos and their alleged ancestors, as Josephus shows. But who are the Hyksos shepherds and who are the Egyptians? History knows nothing of that question and speculates and theorizes out of the depths of respective consciousness of our historians. The fact that there is an archaic... I'm skipping something here. The fact is that in archaic esotericism and Aryan thought we have a grand philosophy, whereas in the Hebrew records we find only the most surprising ingenuity in inventing apotheoses for phallic worship and sexual theogony. That's what Blavatsky says. She also says this is entirely erroneous. Our learned brother and correspondent judges the Hindu religious systems apparently by their Shastras and Puranas, probably the latter, and in their modern translations, moreover, which disfigure them out of all recognition. It is to their philosophical systems that we have to turn, to their esoteric teaching, if we were to make a point of comparison. No doubt the symbology of the Pentateuch and even the New Testament comes from the same source, but surely the pyramid of Cheops, whose measurements are all found by Professor Piazzi Smith, repeated in Solomon's alleged and mythical temple, is not of a later date than the Mosaic books. Hence, if there is any such great identity as is claimed, it must be due to the servile copying on the part of the Jews, not on that of the Egyptians. So there it is, Blavatsky making the same argument that the Jews don't have any culture, they merely copy other cultures, and she throws in that nasty bit at the end, which I read in the middle. I started in the middle, went to the end, and went back to the beginning. And so here, that was Blavatsky, and here with Hitler, even their intellectual powers, sorry, that's the wrong part. Right before that is where he says it, that they, for reasons which will be immediately apparent, the Jew has never possessed a culture of his own, and the basis for his knowledge has always been furnished by the civilizations of others. And he said that quite a bit before that. The Jews... but Jews are hated because they're not idealists, therefore they're anti-Aryan in Hitler's conception. The Jewish people's willingness to self-sacrifice does not go beyond the basic instinct of individual self-preservation. Their strong feeling of racial solidarity is based on a very primitive herd instinct like you see in many other forms of life, because they're basically animals. It is worth mentioning that this herd instinct, that was me saying what Hitler thinks, not what I think, by the way, in case you're an idiot. It is worth mentioning that this herd instinct leads to mutual support only as long as a common danger makes it seem useful or unavoidable. The same pack of wolves which a moment before was united in devouring its prey breaks up into individuals once their hunger has been satisfied. The same is true of horses. They will band together in order to defend themselves against attack and then scatter again when the danger is past. The same holds true for the Jew. His apparent will to self-sacrifice is deceptive. It exists only when the life of each individual is at stake and an alliance becomes absolutely necessary for the preservation of the individual. So here we have not just as the Jew not an idealist, he's also individualistic. The moment the common enemy is defeated, the common danger avoided, or the plunder secured, the apparent harmony of the Jews packed amongst themselves comes to an end, giving way once more to their original natural tendencies. The Jews are in agreement only when a common danger forces them, so they're not communitarian, they are individualist, because that's actually the nature of their religion and what it brought to the world. And so now you're seeing the roots of the anti-Semitism, which, P.S., is here way before the end of World War II. The Jews are in agreement only when a common danger forces them or when a common prey tempts them. When they are not faced with either case, their most insensitive selfish qualities take over, and in an instant these united peoples become a swarm of rats carrying on bloody battle, bitterly fighting against each other. So now we see two traits that make it. So Hitler doesn't like the Jews. One, they are not idealistic, and second, they are not communitarian. And this is really the fundamental essence of what Judaism teaches. And this is why it's so important. This is why I argue that the secret sauce of the West has been the handshake of faith and reason. That could be Jewish faith or Christian faith, I guess, either one. But the handshake of faith and reason, the faith aspect is that it's an individual pursuit. And so that you must stay humble also. So humility and individualism are rooted in faith. Why is individualism a faith thing? Don't we go to church in groups and worship together? Yes, but the point is that you alone choose whether or not you're going to be righteous by either following the law or accepting grace. You alone, individually. The group can't decide for you. And so the individualism is there. And you must live in the world, which means you must understand the world that you live in. So you're not idealistic about the world that could be, even if you can imagine things that could be that are not in existence. It's that you are realistic about the world as it is, and you take the world as it is. So realism and faith, or reason and faith, come together to box out idealism and communitarian tyranny toward that end. And that's the secret sauce of free societies. And the Jews represent that totally. And the United States, by the way, represents that totally as well, being rooted not in a small part on the book of Leviticus, which is in the Torah. I know that a lot of people get mad when I don't say Pentateuch or Old Testament or whatever here, or Bible, but that's where it is. It's the third book of the Torah. Is that right? Yeah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay. If the Jews were alone in the world, Hitler tells us, they would smother in filth and slop and would try to outwit and exterminate one another in a bitter battle. However, the lack of, they got all those kosher laws and stuff, so that's clear. Sarcasm. However, the lack of any willingness for self-sacrifice and the expression of their own cowardice turns even this battle into a pretense. It is a complete mistake, Hitler says, to assume an idealistic self-sacrifice is seen in the Jews when they come together to fight, or rather when they come together to exploit their fellow men. Even here, the Jew is guided by nothing but blatant individual selfishness. For that reason, the Jewish state, which could be a vital organization aimed at the preservation and increase of a race, has no boundaries. In order to have a definite, I think it's actually because the Romans basically obliterated them and chased them out into diaspora, and then set up a lot of hostile power base. And then the Arabs that were Muslim, starting about 500 or 600 years later, weren't really friendly to them. Might be that, you remember the Crusades, were the Christians trying to take back the Holy Land from who? Not from the Jews, not from the Romans, but from the Muslims who took over. So maybe diaspora Hitler has more to do with it than this. But for that reason, the Jewish state, which should be a vital organization aimed at the preservation and increase of a race, has no boundaries. In order to have definite borders for a state which give it structure, one must have an idealistic spirit within the state's race and a proper understanding of the idea of labor. Maybe Hitler also forgot that literally the point of Israel is the covenant for a particular plot of land that they believe they're supposed to have. They can't just go make a state in the middle of fucking China. Like, what are you talking about? But if they tried to make a state in the middle of somewhere, guess what would happen to them? We all know. So any attempt to form or even preserve a state that has no boundaries will fail if this attitude toward work is missing. Without a state, the soul... I've seen a lot of hard work by the Israelites and the Jews in both the world and in the Bible. Without a state, the sole foundation which a culture needs to grow disappears. Despite the Jewish people's apparent intellectual qualities, they still have no true civilization. It's in diaspora, brother. At least not a civilization of their own. Whatever pretense of a civilization the Jew possesses today comes from the contribution of other races, mostly those who were damaged by them. In order to judge the place Jewry holds in human civilization, we must always remember that there has never been any Jewish art, and there is none today. The two queens of the arts, architecture and music, owe nothing original to Jewry, for it has contributed nothing and created nothing. What Jewry accomplishes in the field of art is either a shorter and simpler version of existing works or outright copies of the intellectual products of others. In other words, the Jew lacks those qualities which distinguish that creative and culturally favored race who are the founders of civilization, namely the Aryans. So he's very clear that the Aryans are like exactly the opposite thing, right, to the Jews. It's central to the race ideology that is the worldview of the party, that is the basis of the Nazi state. But he continues, we can see the extent the Jews usurp a civilization created by others, or to be more accurate, how they corrupt it, if we look where he is seen most frequently, in the art which depends the least on personal originality and requires no original invention, by which I mean the dramatic arts. Even here, he is really only using tricks to rearrange the works of others. He can more correctly be called a monkey grinder. He lacks the final touch of greatness or flair which is necessary to produce truly great work. He is not the brilliant creator, but the superficial imitator. And all his retouching and little tricks cannot hide the fact that everything he produces lacks energy or life. So the Jew represents something different than the primitive screwhead that they're used to conquering as allegedly creative civilization-building Aryans. He's competent. But he's not the same as, say, the German, and therefore there must be something vile and evil going on. He's a usurper and a thief. He's not of the advanced Aryan race that can create, so he obviously cannot create, never mind diaspora and all of that. Therefore, it must be the case that he's an imitator and a usurper, a parasite, which is worse than just being a primitive screwhead that seduces your soldiers and leaders into producing inferior mongrels with babies and bastards or whatever else he's called them. But, the Jew's not just an imitator, he says. He says, then the Jewish press provides its loving aid and shouts such high praises over every clumsy and inadequate performer, no matter how mediocre, as long as he is a Jew. The press makes him sound so amazing and wonderful that the rest of the world is fooled into believing it is in the presence of a real artist. But in truth, the man is nothing more than a low-class mime. The Jew possesses no civilization-building power. He has none and never did have the idealism required to improve and develop mankind. Consequently, his intellect is never constructive, but will always be destructive. Do you guys hear that? This is real anti-Semitism way before the end of World War II in Hitler. In very rare cases, and remember the point was to make sure that the bloodlines don't get mixed and to preserve the racial hierarchy. You got to get rid of the things that are destroying your culture and society. I'm just saying. In very rare cases, his intellect may seem at best a stimulus, but even then we see how it becomes twisted into the model for the poet's words. The power whose will is always evil, but who ends up doing good. Which is, it says, a paraphrase of a riddle from Faust, which, based on what is happening in the play where Mephistopheles makes this statement, appears to imply here that Jews do bad things, which have the unintentional result of producing something good. It is not through the Jew's assistance that humanity progresses, but in spite of him. Since the Jew has never had a state with definite territorial boundaries and could never call a civilization his own, some have said they are nomads. Well, Hitler's not going to have that. That idea, he says, is a deceptive mistake. The nomad definitely has a clearly defined territory. Again, we're ignoring diaspora, although he does not cultivate. However, he is unlike the farmer who settles on a piece of land. Instead, he lives off his herds, which he follows as they wander about his territory. The reason he wanders is because the soil is infertile and therefore cannot support a settlement. The deeper cause, however, lies in the lack of a technical civilization which is needed to compensate for the sparse resources. There are areas where development has taken place over more than 1,000 years, and it was possible only because of the technology of the Aryan, who was able to make himself the master over large areas and establish solid settlements that can support him. But we're not conquering nature, he said at the beginning. If he did not have this technology, he would either have to avoid these areas or live as a constantly wandering nomad. That is, if after thousands of years of living with his technical developments, the idea of a sedentary nomadic life was not intolerable to him. We must remember that at the time when the American continent was being settled, many Aryans struggled for a livelihood as trappers and hunters, etc. They were often in large groups with their wives and children and always on the move. Their existence was exactly like that of nomads. But as soon as their numbers grew to a certain point and better equipment made it possible to tame the land and resist the natives, more and more settlements sprang up throughout the country. The Aryan was probably the original nomad. And so, of course, he was. And over the course of time settled in one place. But even so, he was never a Jew. This is Hitler, man. I love listening to these idiots on the woke right try to tell me that Hitler didn't have any anti-Semitism and that wasn't part of the program. Where here we are reading something written, more than a decade before, or around a decade before he took power. And it's very, very clear what's going on with the anti-Semitism. He says, no, the Jew is not a nomad. Even the nomad had a definite concept of work, which would serve as the basis which he built his civilization on. There's a certain amount of idealism in the attitude of the nomad, even though it is primitive. His whole nature may be foreign to the Aryan, but it's not disgusting to him. However, this attitude simply does not exist in the Jew. Therefore, the Jew has never been the nomad, but instead has always been a parasite, fattening himself on the body of other peoples. The fact that he has abandoned previous regions was not by choice. He was driven out by his hosts, who had become tired of having their hospitality abused by these, quote, guests. Jewish expansion is an act typical of all parasites. He's constantly looking for a new land for his race. No, he's actually looking for the old one, frankly. This has nothing to do with being a nomad, because the Jew never dreams of leaving an area or vacating a territory once he is there. He stays where he is, and he holds on to it so intently that he is very hard to get rid of, even by force. He believes in property rights. He also believes in conservatism, generally, when he's not a progressive weirdo. He only spreads to new countries when conditions necessary for his existence attract him. However, unlike the nomad, he doesn't change his previous residence. He remains a typical parasite, spreading like a harmful bacteria wherever he finds a suitable place to grow. The effect of this parasite, wherever he happens to be, causes the host nation to die off sooner or later. So please again tell me, woke right, that Hitler wasn't anti-Semitic. But you'll have to shift from it's not happening to it's happening and it's a good thing. And the people who are warning us about it are the real problem, right? The Jew, Hitler says, has always lived in the states of other races, and within that state he has created his own state. The state within a state sailed under the colors of a religious community and continued to do so as long as he was not forced to reveal his true nature. That's what Marx said, too, on the Jewish question. Once he thought he was strong enough and no longer needed to hide, he would drop the veil and suddenly all would see what so many had refused to see and to believe previously, the real character of the Jew. Hitler says the Jew's life as a parasite within the body of other nations and states is the origin of an unusual characteristic which caused Schopenhauer to describe the Jew as the great master of lies. This kind of existence drives the Jew to lie and lie regularly and methodically in an orderly, businesslike way which comes as naturally to them as warm clothes to those who live in cold climates. His life within a nation can only continue if he convinces the people that Jews are not a separate people, but merely a religious community, although an unusual one. But this itself is the first great lie. So this is why Hitler has to think of Jews as a race. So it can't be a plurality of peoples that are all in some way, say, German. They enjoy German custom, they speak German language, but they also have their own religion as a unique religious community. No, there have to be something deeper, an ethnicity with a completely separate bloodline that's not of the master race. He says in order to carry on his existence as a parasite among the other nations, he must conceal his inner character. The more intelligent the individual Jew is, the more successful his deception will be. This deception may even convince parts of the host nation that the Jew is really a Frenchman or an Englishman, or a German or an Italian, just a person of a different religious persuasion. Government offices are particularly easy victims of this notorious trick because bureaucrats have little sense when it comes to history and only react to a fraction of actual history. In such circles, independent thinking is often considered a sin against sacred rules that determine who is promoted and who is not. Because of this, we must not be surprised that the Bavarian state ministry, for instance, even today, doesn't have the faintest idea that the Jews are members of a separate people and not of a simple religious group. One glance at the world of Jewish newspapers immediately proves this, even to someone of the most ordinary intellect. Of course, the Jewish Echo is not yet an official government journal, so in the mind of these government officials, they have no need to read it. Jewry, he says, has always been a nation with definite racial characteristics, and it has never been identified solely as a religion. Their need to advance in the world caused the Jew to search for a method that would distract undesirable attention from its members. So Hitler's racial obsession is projecting onto a real fact that Jews tend to marry Jews and that they do have a concern for ethnicity and the various tribes and all of this. What could have been more effective and more innocent in appearance than a religious community? Even here, Hitler says, everything is borrowed or rather stolen. The Jew could never create a religious institution on his own because he lacks any form of idealism which would be needed to create such a cover. So no idealism and no religion, apparently. The lack of idealism means that a belief in any life hereafter is absolutely foreign to him. According to the Aryan concept, no religion could be conceived that lacks a belief in some form of life after death. In fact, the Talmud is a book that explains how to prepare for a practical and prosperous life in this world, and it says nothing about preparation for the hereafter. The Jewish religious teachings consist mainly of rules to keep the blood of Jews pure and to regulate the dealings of Jews amongst themselves, and even more with the rest of the world with the non-Jews. Even here, the rules consist of extremely petty economic guides and are not concerned with ethical problems. For a long time, there have been very detailed studies made which reviewed the moral value of the Jewish religious teachings. These studies were certainly not made by Jews because the Jews twist their statements to suit their own purpose. The Aryans who conducted these studies found this kind of religion to be detestable. The clearest, are you wondering, by the way, and just pointing out, we're going through, just to remind you of the context of this nasty shit, we are reviewing the racialist world concept of the Nazis, which is the basis for their worldview and their party and their state. And it's widely claimed by members of the woke right that Hitler was forced into anti-Semitism, but he sounds pretty enthusiastic about it way before the war, just to point that out. You can predict where this is going. He's calling them bacteria and parasites, that the death of the nation. Like, you can predict where this could go, right? It's not hard. This is, again, published in 1925, so way before the rise of the Third Reich. So anyway, the clearest indication, he said, of what this religious education can produce is the Jew himself. His life is only concerned with this world, and his inner spirit is as foreign to true Christianity as his nature was 2,000 years ago to the great founder of the new teaching himself, Jesus Christ. Jesus made no secret of his feelings toward the Jewish people and even used the whip to drive this rival out of the Lord's temple. This sounds like Satan, aka Adolf Hitler, is quoting scripture to his purposes, but misquoting it pretty badly. It was the money changers who were desecrating the religious institution that Hitler said they couldn't even build that Jesus was driving out. Not the Jew, the money changer. And his beef was not with the Jews, it was with the Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and the scribes and the money changers who he exposed turned him over to the hostile Roman state so that they would execute him on their behalf because they were power and money-hungry deviants that Jesus was calling out. The Jews did not kill Jesus, if you didn't know this. It was a cabal of, well, cabal is maybe a bad word to use here, I guess, but it was a motivated group of bad actors, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the money changers that were pissed off at him for calling them out and calling them to spiritual purity. Anyway, even then, Hitler tells us, the Jewish religion was just a means to make money as a business. No, that's what Jesus was driving it out because it was a desecration to the religion that he was, which was Jewish. Christ was nailed to the cross for his intolerance of the Jews. No, he was nailed to the cross for his intolerance of what amounts to blasphemy and religious desecration of something considered sacred to the Jews. While our present Christian political parties lower themselves in elections by begging for Jewish votes. Afterwards, they try to hatch deceitful political plots with the Jewish atheist parties and against its own nationality. On this first and biggest lie that Jewry is not a race but a religion, the Jew builds subsequent lies. So I'm just telling you, the anti-Semitism is pretty clear here, guys. To him, language is not a way to express his thoughts, but a way to conceal them. So the Jew is literally equated with Satan as the master and father of lies, when literally one of their commandments is thou shalt not bear false witness. When he speaks French, his thinking is Jewish. When he is fabricating German rhymes, nothing he says can be believed because he's just expressing the nature of his own race, that of the lie. As long as the Jew has not become the master of other peoples, he must speak their languages, but the instant they become his slaves, they will have to learn an artificial universal language like Esperanto. Take that, George Soros. So that Jewry could rule them more easily. To be fair, the Esperanto was a really stupid experiment. The whole existence of these people completely depends on one continuous lie, and this is uniquely proven in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Editor's note, which is an anti-Semitic work outlining a plot by Jewish and Masonic elements to achieve world domination. Today, the manuscript is known to be a forgery. In fact, it was by the Russian czars to displace many of the things they were actually doing onto the Jews as scapegoats. Okay, so this whole existence of the people completely depends on one continuous lie, and this is uniquely proven in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that is so bitterly hated by the Jews. Yeah, because it's a friggin' forgery that is full of anti-Semitic tropes that were actionable against their people. The Frankfurter Zeitung, which is the newspaper in Frankfurt, if you don't know, keeps groaning to the world that they are a forgery, which is the best proof that they are genuine. Sounds like Tucker Carlson and Ian Carroll. What many Jews wish to do unconsciously is consciously made clear here. It does not matter what Jewish mind these revelations come from. What matters is that they uncover the nature and activity of the Jewish people with absolutely horrible accuracy and show their inner connections as well as their ultimate goal. This book, meaning the Protocols, shows how the Jewish mind works, even though it's a forgery. And the activities described as well as the methods are characteristic of the Jewish people. The best test of the authenticity of these documents is by studying current events. Anyone who examines the historical development of the last 100 years with the revelations in this book will immediately understand why the Jewish press is so upset and denounces it constantly. Once the contents of this book have become general public knowledge, the Jewish threat can be considered destroyed. So I'm going to pause and skip a bunch here. I'm not going to pause, actually. I'm just going to skip a bunch here. And he's going to explain, the next part starts with, in order to know the Jew properly, it's best to study the road he has taken through other nations in recent centuries. So he goes through this very long explanation of how the Jew is taken over as in his perspective in other countries and also in Germany. The first Jews came to what is now Germany during the advance of the Romans. As always, they came as traders. And this goes on for a lot of pages. He says we're going to organize it into letters of the alphabet. And it goes to letter L. And some of these are several pages long each. So we've got to scroll down till that ends. Hang on a second. There's a lot. Letter H. Letter H is very long. Where is even I? J. Okay, past I. I'm telling you, it's crazy pages of. It goes all the way to letter L of him explaining the process of how Jews take over. It's so long on some of these that you don't realize that there's still letters going on. Letter K, like I'm not joking. Letter K. What does it say? The Jew's domination of the state government seems so assured that he can now openly admit to his basic racial and political beliefs and publicly call himself as a Jew again. One part of the Jewish race quite openly admits to being an alien people, though not without lying again. Even here, I'm just going to tell you that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in this book. It's very clear. When Zionism tries to convince the world that racial self-determination of the Jew would be satisfied with the creation of their own state in Palestine, the Jews are once again craftily pulling the wool over the eyes of the stupid Goyim. They never intended to build a Jewish state in Palestine, not for the purpose of living in it anyway. They just want an organization headquarters for their international swindling and cheating, with its own political power that is beyond the reach and interference from other states. It would be a refuge for crooks who are being exposed in a college for future swindlers. So there's all of our favorite people on Twitter, right? Letter L. That's the last letter, but I've just got to figure out where he stops talking about letter L and switches into actually talking again. Okay. I think, let's see. Yeah. So if we review all the causes of the German collapse, he says the failure to recognize the race problem and especially the Jewish menace remains the ultimate and decisive factor. Hitler's project, the Nazi experiment, was a racial worldview based on German Aryan supremacy and Jewish scapegoating and hatred. It is absolutely clear, it's not just inferior races, but specifically Jews as a parasite race, that Hitler is blaming for what? All the causes of German collapse. The ultimate and decisive factor is the failure to recognize the race problem and especially the Jewish menace. Do not let these people lie to you and gaslight you that the Nazi project was not racist to the core. It is, as you've heard, and fundamental, and not just racist, racially eugenicist in favor of its, favored Aryan people that Hitler wasn't even one of. And then also recognizing the Jewish menace to the nation and to the race. This is standing up under the defeats of the battlefield standing up under the defeats on the battlefield in August of 1918, when they lost World War I, would have been child's play. These were nothing compared to the victories of our people in past battles. It wasn't those military defeats that led to our downfall. We were brought down by a power that has been preparing us for decades to suffer those defeats. They systematically robbed our people of the political and moral instincts that allowed us to survive, the very qualities that gave a people the right to exist, by neglecting their responsibility to preserve the racial foundations of our nationality. The old empire also discarded the only right that can give a people their authority to live in this world. Nations who become mongrels, or who allow their people to be bastardized, have sinned against the will of eternal providence. Their collapse at the hands of a stronger force is not an injustice done to them. Instead, it is the restoration of justice. If a people no longer respect the qualities given to it by nature, qualities which are deeply rooted in its blood, it surrenders its right to complain when its earthly existence is at an end. That's deeply embedded in the core of the racial worldview at the heart of the Nazi experiment. Every negative event in the world can be turned into a positive one. What a sunshiny statement. Every defeat may father a later victory. Every lost war may be the cause of a later resurgence. Every distress may inspire a new surge in man's willpower. A new spiritual rebirth may spring from every oppression, but this can occur only as long as the racial blood is kept pure. The loss of blood purity by itself will forever destroy inner happiness and forever lowers man. The result of impurity can never be eliminated from man's body and spirit. If we compare all the other problems we face in life against this one question of race, Hitler says, we immediately realize how small those daily problems are. Again, the racialist worldview of the Nazi experiment, plus its intrinsic deep anti-Semitism. The Jews were an inferior race that acts as a parasite that cannot be squashed into slavery by the native race, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And so therefore they are a major problem that will parasitize and destroy your nation, especially since they want civil equality and to be allowed to practice their religious beliefs in peace and interact in society, productively in their own ways. Of course, nobody mentioned that a lot of the things that Hitler complains about that they do as professions are because they were prohibited by religious exclusion, lack of civil rights, from having other jobs. Just pointing that out. Those problems, all regular problems compared to race, he says, are all temporary and limited, but the preservation of blood purity continues for as long as there are men on this earth. All the significant symptoms of decay before the war can be traced back to these basic racial causes, whether the question is one of universal justice or of a massive wart on economic life, or signs of cultural decline, or indications of political degeneration, or one of defective school teaching, or one of negative influences through the press. There is one truth that is present always and everywhere. The bottom line is that the source of our problems is a neglect for our own people's racial concerns and a failure to see approaching alien racial threat. Weimar problems require Weimar solutions is the woke right slogan they don't bring out into the daylight very often. Let me read that again. So just remember, Weimar problems require Weimar solutions is the slogan of the uglier side of the woke right. They quote unquote hide their power level on that and don't say that one out loud very much. Okay, so Germany has problems. We're talking about the Nazi experiment. It's a interwar period just after World War I. In fact, Germany has problems. Whether the question is one of universal justice or a massive war on economic life or of signs of cultural decline or indications of political degeneration or one of defective school teachings or one of negative influences through the press, in other words, Weimar problems, there is one truth that is present always and everywhere. The bottom line is that the source of our problems, Weimar problems, is a neglect of our own people's racial concerns and a failure to see an approaching alien racial threat, which requires Weimar solutions, aka the Nazi experiment, which we know was a catastrophic failure and should not be repeated. Never again was then, never again is now. Therefore, all attempts at reform, Hitler says, all social work and political efforts, all economic advancement, and all apparent increases in spiritual knowledge have ultimately failed to produce any results of value. The nation and that being which makes it possible, the state, have failed to build inner strength. They have not grown healthier, but have visibly wasted away from this disease. All the false prosperity of the old empire could not hide the inner weakness, and every attempt to strengthen the empire was abruptly halted when this, the most important question, the race question, and the Jewish question, was ignored and set aside. Remember, the Jewish question means, what do we do with the Jews? Or really, how do we get rid of them? It would be a mistake, Hitler tells us, to think that all of those who doctored the German political body with various political ideas and their leaders were bad or malicious men by nature. No matter what they did, their work was condemned to fail, at best. Because at best they only saw the symptoms of our general sickness and tried to combat those obvious signs. They then walked blindly into the root cause of the disease. Anyone who has calmly and systematically traced the old empire's line of political development cannot help but realize that even when the German nation was unified and on the rise, its inner decay was already in full swing. Despite all the political successes that seemed to occur in an increasing economic wealth, The general situation grew worse from year to year. Even the rising tide of Marxist votes at the Reichstag elections foreshadowed the ever-approaching inner and outer collapse. The success of the middle and upper class political parties meant nothing. This was not only because they could not prevent the numerical growth of the Marxist flood, even when they had so-called victorious middle upper class elections, but mostly because they had already carried the seeds of degeneration within themselves. The upper class world itself had no idea it was infected with the rotting flesh virus of Marxist ideas. The occasional visible resistance to Marxism was usually due to envy and competition between ambitious leaders and not based on principles or beliefs by those determined to fight to the bitter end. One figure alone fought throughout those long years with unshakable perseverance, and this figure was the Jew. The Star of David rose higher as the will for the self-preservation among our own people disappeared. In August of 1914, so everything that went bad in World War I is about to get laid on the Jews, the battlefield was not stormed by a solid nation with a determined spirit. Only a small glimmer of the nation's self-preservation instinct remained as a result of the pacifist Marxist paralysis infected on our political body. In those days, the enemy within remained unrecognized. This failure to see the inner cause meant all outer resistance was useless. That is why Providence did not deliver a sword of victory as the reward, but instead followed the law of eternal retribution. From this realization came the guiding principles and the tendency of our new movement. That's the Nazi movement, guys. We were convinced that only by recognizing these truths could we alone stop the decline of the German people and lay a solid foundation on which a new state may someday exist, a state that will not be part of an alien machine of economic concerns and interests, but a being of the people, a Germanic state and a German nation. And so that's chapter 11, or most of it, of Hitler's Mein Kampf, volume 1. And there at the end, he lays out very clearly the Nazi experiment, right? So from this realization came the guiding principles and tendency of our new movement. There's our Nazi experiment. They were convinced of their Weimar problems, and they were going to deliver Weimar solutions, meaning actually Nazi solutions. We were convinced that only by recognizing these truths, which is the racialist worldview and the parasitism of the Jew, could we alone stop the decline of the German people and lay a solid foundation on which a new state may someday exist, one that's born in the worldview of racial purity and the exclusion and actually removal of the Jew. That state, he says, will not be a part of an alien machine of economic concerns and interests, but a being of the people. So I think he's probably referring to the League of Nations there and the International Trade Order. And he says it's going to be a Germanic state in a German nation. So one of the woke right tropes that we deal with about the Nazis is that Hitler was just a big lover of the German people and the German idea and the German program. And that's not quite true. There's his Germanic, nation in a German state, or a Germanic people in a German nation vision actually is built off of the racialist worldview that we talked about in the previous episode, and that's extremely racially eugenicist through brutal application of what he called natural law, and a firm recognition that the Jew is a parasite upon Germany that if it's not dealt with will cause the ruin of the nation. So the racism, the anti-Semitism are intrinsic to the Nazi experiment. Absolutely intrinsic. So you can't get away from them. So we have to be more clear-eyed about what the Nazi experiment is about, and that we're being lied to about it by either opportunists or fools or some of both in the present circumstance. And what that reminds us, since we're being lied to about it in that way and with such specificity, is that never again is now. We have to take this seriously. This matters. And so just to summarize quickly, the Nazi experiment was that Germany was facing a variety of challenges and problems in the World War I loss and interwar period, some of which became the Weimar Republic, which was decadent and weak and foolish. And Hitler provided a set of solutions by proposing an experiment, a social, political, and economic experiment that is called today Nazism, or National Socialism as it was then. And that program was based on a racialist worldview and a dislike and hatred of the allegedly parasitic Jews against that racialist nation, and military conquest, and the idea that by subjugating all the people in the world to this program, being led by the Aryan people or ruled by the Aryan people that the Nazis represented and were purifying the blood of, without any will or interest to despoil that blood through intermixing later, that we could properly have peace. And so the Nazi long goal would be massive world conquering, maybe conquering an empire of the entire world that would be run by the Nazis, and this would see the organization and or enslavement of all the people the Nazis believed to be inferior, except for a few types of people, the mentally retarded or deficient or whatever, the political heretic and rebel, and the Jew, who embodies individualism and realism and industry within the capacity they has. Those things must all be stamped out. So they're all going to have to be gotten rid of completely. And that's the Nazi experiment. And like I said, it was a resounding catastrophe. Its will for empire actually triggered the most violent conflict in the history of man, the Second World War, and was an utter catastrophe for all of Europe and much of the world, all of Japan, lots of China actually too. A lot of people don't talk about that. Countless of our own fathers and grandfathers died to stop that menace, that imperial menace that Hitler was driving through his racialist worldview to establish a global peace under tyrannical Aryan rule, where all of humanity would be brutally enslaved, while the Aryans maintained their racial purity over in Germany so that they could rule everything. And we have to face this menace now, not just here through the resurgence of not just propaganda and lies, but actual interest in National Socialism and outright Nazism, but also in the fact that the CCP has adopted much of this model for its own. You might have noticed that they are a rather racially interested polity. They're not merely communist in the old international sense. Something is different. And I've talked in the past about the stakeholderism that they adopted under Deng Xiaoping, gave them the economic Nazi model, the Führer principle, where the Führer at this point actually becomes the chairman of the CCP, but the CCP itself actually operates as the party apparatus, operates as the Führer, with the chairman, obviously, in this case Xi Jinping being the guy at the top. So they adopted the economic model of the Nazis, but they have this racial element as well going on in China. The Chinese fundamentally believe themselves in many cases to be racially superior to everybody else, and that they uniquely can usher in great prosperity and technology and everything else. So we have to deal with this in a very real way there as well, at the same time as having to deal with whatever this goofy human evolution communist new age bullcrap is at the United Nations through the World Economic Forum. So this is a major thing to understand, but this is the Nazi experiment. And the point, as always, and I'll close with that, is that the Nazi experiment failed miserably. We should not repeat it. It was not the way to deal with so-called Weimar problems. They did that experiment. The results were a disaster. We should not repeat them. Repeating the same experiment again and expecting different results is, in a sense, the definition of madness. I know it's long. Thanks for listening. We'll have more episodes soon.